At that time, she was surprised. She hadn't expected the man rumored to be cold, ruthless, and decisive in killing to have such refined taste. Fortunately, she didn't have a particular preference for any color, so she simply wore blue along with him. "Miss, where are we going?" After walking aimlessly for a long time, Lillian Moore finally couldn't help but ask. Margaret Harrington stopped, looking at the bustling street ahead, her beautiful eyes filled with confusion. Where to go? She didn't know either. She was simply troubled, so she had come out for a stroll. But in this entire capital, apart from Harrington Manor, she had nowhere else to go. That's right, she hadn't seen her adoptive father in a long time. Since she had nothing to do, she would visit him. Having made up her mind, she was about to look for the tavern her adoptive father had mentioned when she saw a familiar man approaching, causing her to stop in surprise. 3 handsomely dressed men walked towards her, led by a tall man in blue brocade, accompanied by a man in white with a gentle expression. The two were talking about something. Behind them was a man in black with a cold expression, dressed like a guard. The man in blue looked up and, upon seeing Margaret Harrington standing by the road, a look of surprise and doubt flickered across his expressionless face, but it vanished in an instant. He strode towards her, his voice tinged with reproach. "Why did you leave the manor? It's so cold, and you didn't even wear more clothes." He reached out and tightened her cloak. Margaret Harrington didn't say anything, but a warm current flowed through her heart. "Is this, the princess consort?" The man in white beside him stepped forward, looking at Margaret Harrington and asking. Margaret Harrington looked up at him. A very handsome man, around 25 or 26 years old, with sword-like eyebrows and bright eyes, a gentle expression, and a slight smile on his lips, he looked very friendly. But she seemed to have met him somewhere before. "Dr. Mason, this is my princess consort. I was in a hurry last time, so I haven't introduced you yet." Edward Harrington said to the man in white, then turned to Margaret Harrington. "MacNhi, this is Dr. Mason, a good friend of mine. Don't underestimate him. This young man is the famous divine physician of our Windcloud Empire." She hadn't expected him to be a physician. Hearing Edward Harrington's casual and intimate tone, it was clear the two had a close relationship. Edward Harrington said, "Last time," and she vaguely recalled that after her unpleasant parting with Evan Gray, she had happened to meet Edward Harrington, and it seemed there was a man in white beside him at the time. So it was him. "Your Highness is too kind. Dr. Mason doesn't dare accept the title of divine physician. I only know a little." Dr. Mason said with a smile, "I've long heard of the princess consort's reputation, and it's a blessing to meet you today." "You're too kind, sir," Margaret Harrington said politely. "Dr. Mason enjoys traveling the world, and each trip lasts for months. I've just returned. I was planning to hold a banquet for him, but I didn't expect you to be out of the manor as well." Edward Harrington said to Margaret Harrington, "Then let's go together." Margaret Harrington nodded, not refusing. They went to the Xing Long Tavern, and by the time they left, it was past noon. Dr. Mason excused himself and left, and Margaret Harrington followed Edward Harrington back to the prince's manor. "Where are we going?" After walking for a while, Margaret Harrington realized something was wrong. This wasn't the way back to the manor. So she asked the tall and handsome man beside her. "This is the road out of the city." Edward Harrington looked at her and said, his handsome face expressionless, his deep eyes making it impossible to discern his thoughts. "If I remember correctly, today is the day the Moonlight Empire's envoy leaves the capital. Based on the time, they should be setting off soon." "Your Highness." Margaret Harrington looked at him in surprise. She wanted to tell him that she didn't want to see Evan Gray, but for some reason, she couldn't open her mouth. Edward Harrington pulled her into his arms, looked into her eyes, and said, "I know you still want to see that face one last time, so I'm taking you to see him. I just want you to be happy." Faced with his deep affection, Margaret Harrington was moved to tears at this moment. She actively leaned into his embrace, her small face pressed against his chest, her arms tightly wrapped around his strong waist. This man gave her a sense of protection. She truly yearned for it. Edward Harrington gently stroked her hair, a hint of bitterness and a sigh flashing through his eyes. Evan Gray was the man he hated to the core, so why would he want her to see him? But he knew she couldn't let go of her past life, couldn't let go of the face identical to Evan Gray's, or she wouldn't have left the manor today. As long as she was happy, he was willing to do anything, except let her go. Standing in the farewell pavilion outside the city, she watched the Moonlight Empire envoy's procession pass before her eyes, then disappear into the distance. Margaret Harrington felt as if her past life was leaving her. Charles Stone had left her life, from this moment on, she would let go. In this life, she is only Edward Harrington's wife. Let's go. She lifted her head from his warm embrace and spoke. Yes. He replied, then asked, why not go and talk to him for a bit? From beginning to end, she never left his embrace, even when meeting Evan Gray, she didn't change, nor did she go to say goodbye to him, only watching from afar. And Evan Gray only glanced at them in surprise, not approaching. This surprised him greatly. No need. I don't like him. Margaret Harrington coldly uttered the words that pleased him, then her sparkling eyes gazed intently at him, saying, let's go home. Yes, let's go home. Edward Harrington embraced her, a genuine smile flashing across his usually expressionless face. Aunt Margaret, look, my snowman is almost finished. Ha! Mine is almost done too. Aunt Margaret, come and help. The gentle golden sunlight shone down on the elegant courtyard, making the snow covering the ground reflect a brilliant light. Against the thick snow, two lively small figures and a slender woman were particularly eye-catching. Children's laughter echoed in the small courtyard. Two small figures clumsily built snowmen, their small faces flushed with cold but full of excitement. The two children wore thick cotton coats, round like balls, extremely adorable. The boy in the green cotton coat was the little crowned Prince Lance Harrington of the Windcloud Empire, and the girl in the pink cotton coat was the only princess of the Windcloud Empire, Gillian Harrington. Today, Emperor James Harrington came to visit, bringing these two innocent children. He and Edward Harrington went to the study to discuss work, sending the two children to the Falling Lotus Pavilion. It had just snowed yesterday, leaving a thick layer in the courtyard. Margaret Harrington loved the pristine white snow, so she didn't let the servants sweep it away. The two children were extremely excited when they saw the snow-covered ground and asked to build snowmen. Margaret Harrington indulged them, joining them in building snowmen in the courtyard. Aunt Margaret, how's my snowman? Standing in front of a newly completed snowman, the boy excitedly called out. The snowman he built was almost as tall as him, two large and small snowballs stacked on top of each other, the smaller snowball with three small stones for eyes and a mouth, innocent and adorable. Very lovely, Lance, well done. Margaret Harrington smiled and praised. Really? This is the first time I've built a snowman, it's so fun. The boy exclaimed excitedly, not noticing the snow reddening his small hands. In the palace, those servants wouldn't dare let him play in the snow, afraid he'd get cold. His mother wouldn't let him linger in the snow either, so he had never played in the snow so happily. The first snowman he built with his own hands truly made him extremely excited. Aunt Margaret, Selina Joy's is finished too. A clear, childish voice also rang out, timid, but unable to hide the excitement. Margaret Harrington turned to look and saw the little princess standing in front of a small snowman, her big, round eyes sparkling with anticipation, extremely adorable. Her snowman was also made of two large and small snowballs, but slightly smaller than the boy's snowman, the lines also rounder and more delicate. Selina Joy's snowman is very beautiful. Well done. Margaret Harrington walked over, affectionately stroking her head, praising her. A happy smile immediately bloomed on the little girl's face. Aunt Margaret, our snowmen are missing arms. How can a snowman not have arms? The boy suddenly exclaimed, his small brows furrowed in thought. That's right, what can we use for the snowman's arms? The little girl also frowned. Can we use carrots? The little girl cried out. No. Carrots are too short, how can they be arms? The boy objected, then excitedly said, the snowman is also missing a nose, using a carrot would be perfect. Selena Joy is so smart. Yes, brother, a carrot for the nose is great. The little girl tilted her head in thought, happily agreeing with her brother's decision. Someone, go find 2 carrots, they must be long and beautiful. The boy commanded in a pompous manner. Yes, your highness, I'll go right away. Lillian Moore, who had been attending to them, quickly replied and hurried towards the kitchen. What should we use? The boy frowned. Margaret Harrington looked at the 2 adorable children, the corners of her lips curving into a breathtakingly beautiful smile. In contrast to the cheerful and relaxed atmosphere in the Falling Lotus Pavilion, a heavy and gloomy atmosphere enveloped the Manor's study. Dr. Mason, haven't you found the antidote yet? The young emperor in his imperial robes, James Harrington, asked the white-clad man sitting opposite him with a melancholic expression. ### Chapter 42, Childbirth. The white-robed man shook his head helplessly. Dr. Mason, I am inadequate. This time, I traveled to various countries, gathering medicinal ingredients to concoct the purple fragrance pill, enough for a year's supply. However, the purple fragrance pill is merely a miraculous painkiller, it treats the symptoms, not the root cause. Moreover, with prolonged use, its analgesic effect will gradually weaken. If even the purple fragrance pill loses its effectiveness, what then? The young emperor asked, clearly deeply worried. Brother, Edward Harrington, who had been silent, finally spoke, don't worry. I've grown accustomed to it over the years. It's fundamentally incurable, so let's not waste any more resources. No. James Harrington refused. How, you can't give up. Nothing is incurable, we will definitely find a way to detoxify you. You don't need to worry about this, I will find it. Once the poison is neutralized, you won't have to suffer anymore. Brother, Edward Harrington called out, filled with gratitude and helplessness. Have you heard of the ice jade toad? My men have found traces of it. I believe we will find it soon. The ice jade toad? Dr. Mason exclaimed. The legendary ancient divine creature, capable of neutralizing all poisons, the martial world's ultimate treasure. Yes. It was once the heirloom of the Zheng family, a prominent martial arts clan, but 30 years ago, it was stolen by a martial arts eccentric, Henry Fletcher. Afterward, the eccentric vanished without a trace. But, as long as he's still alive, I will find him. Brother, that man has been missing for over 30 years. Don't get your hopes up too high. Edward Harrington advised, then chuckled bitterly. I'm used to it. James Harrington looked at his suffering brother, speechless, but his eyes were filled with sorrow. Your Highness, His Majesty is right. Don't give up. Dr. Mason urged. Now, you're not alone, you have your princess to care for. Margaret, thinking of that beautiful, cold woman, Edward Harrington couldn't help but be lost in thought. How, does Margaret know? James Harrington asked cautiously. No, Edward Harrington shook his head, then looked firmly at his brother. Brother, don't tell her. No matter what, don't tell her. I don't want her to be disgusted by me. Sigh. James Harrington sighed helplessly. The children are playing in Margaret's courtyard. Let's go see them. After a long while, Edward Harrington put away his helplessness and sorrow, a smile appearing on his face. All right, he said to the other two. As soon as the 3 entered the Falling Leaves Pavilion, they heard the excited cheers of children. Looking up, they saw 3 snowmen, 1 large and 2 small, standing in the snowy courtyard. In front of the snowmen were two cheering, jumping children and a beautiful woman with a faint smile. As soon as the children saw them, they excitedly ran over and clung to James Harrington. "Father, look, those are the snowmen we built. Aren't they beautiful?" Aunt Margaret said the two small snowmen are Selina Joy and brother, and the big one is Aunt Margaret, the little girl added excitedly. James Harrington looked at the three snowmen, with stones for eyes and mouths, carrots for noses, and branches for arms. They looked adorable. Very beautiful. Father didn't expect Lance and Selina Joy to be so skilled, building such lovely snowmen, James Harrington said kindly. "Thank you, Father." The two children beamed. Edward Harrington went to Margaret Harrington's side, took her icy hand, and said with a hint of reproach, "It's so cold, why aren't you staying inside? You're out here playing with the children. Look, your hands are freezing." Margaret Harrington smiled. "I don't feel cold. These children are truly adorable." Looking at her charming face, Edward Harrington suddenly grinned mischievously, leaning close to her ear and whispering, "You can also have one. Looks like I'll have to work hard later." His hot breath against her ear made her blush. She glared at him and pushed him away. Shameless. Edward Harrington just chuckled foolishly. "I'm talking about serious matters. How is that shameless?" Giving him an annoyed glance, Margaret Harrington turned and went inside. Edward Harrington hurriedly followed, completely oblivious to the other two in the courtyard, the Emperor of the Windcloud Empire and the Divine Physician, Dr. Mason. Oh well, this had happened many times already. Over the past month, the other two had gotten used to it. Initially intending to practice calligraphy to alleviate boredom, Margaret Harrington unexpectedly sketched the face of a man, a broad forehead, sharp eyebrows, narrow eyes, a straight nose, perfect features, like a meticulously sculpted work of art. The coldness and nobility emanating from between his brows made it difficult to look directly at him. His sharp, hawk-like eyes, cold, keen, and domineering, clearly revealed the man's inner world. Looking at this handsome face, Margaret Harrington was both surprised and bewildered. She hadn't expected that she would casually draw him, Edward Harrington. When had he quietly entered her heart? Was it possible? He was merely her source of protection in this unfamiliar world, so when did he enter her heavily guarded heart? Hadn't she vowed not to love him? But why did she unconsciously draw him? Wasn't she still in love with Charles Stone? Even though that wasn't the real Charles Stone, but a deceptive facade he used to beguile her. Although she claimed to have let go, there was no reason for her to have forgotten him so quickly and placed Edward Harrington in her heart. How could this be? Had she fallen for Edward Harrington's tenderness so quickly? Setting Edward Harrington's portrait aside, she spread another sheet of paper and sketched the features of another man. Short hair, a gentle face, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth, it was the face of Charles Stone in her memory. After finishing, she quietly looked at him, only to realize that this face in her memory no longer held the same allure as before. Should she be happy? Now, she was gradually forgetting Charles Stone and developing feelings for her current husband. It was just that she didn't know if she could bear this feeling. He was infatuated with her now, protecting her with all his might, but who could guarantee that he wasn't like Charles Stone, toying with her affections? Born into royalty, he was inherently heartless. Could his feelings be trusted? In her turmoil, she casually tossed the two portraits aside, mixing them with the scraps of paper from her earlier calligraphy practice, and said coldly, "Clear these scraps out." "Yes," replied Helena, the maid who was grinding ink beside her, then cleared the scraps out of the room. Margaret Harrington sat at the desk and resumed her calligraphy practice, completely unaware of the sinister and triumphant smile on Helena's lips as she left the room. Lillian Moore was originally Margaret Harrington's personal maid, but Lillian had caught a cold these past few days, so Margaret Harrington let her rest in her room, relieving her of her duties. Thus, the task of attending to her fell to the senior maid, Helena. Helena intensely disliked this princess, who was infinitely doted on by the prince, and resented serving her. However, she hadn't expected such an unexpected gain today. This made her feel genuinely happy for the first time. Don't think that having a fox-like face can bewitch the prince and earn his favor. With me, Helena, around, I will definitely make the prince abandon you. The prince can only be mine, Helena's. Helena thought stubbornly. While she was intently writing complex ancient characters, a shadow suddenly fell over her. Looking up, she saw a handsome face smiling. Margaret, practicing your calligraphy? Edward Harrington said, a sly smile playing on his lips. Yes, Margaret Harrington replied curtly, ignoring him and lowering her head to continue writing. This arrogant man, every time she practiced calligraphy, he would smile like a fox. Wasn't he laughing at her poor handwriting? What was so funny? His handwriting wasn't much better. All right, Margaret, don't be angry anymore. I'll stop laughing, okay? Edward Harrington wrapped his arms around her slender waist, pulling her into his embrace, coaxing her with a smile. Don't touch me. I'm busy. Margaret Harrington pushed him away unhappily. Unfazed, Edward Harrington scooped Margaret up, settled onto a chair with her on his lap, one arm securing her waist. Stay still, I'll teach you to write, he murmured, his warm breath tickling her ear, instantly subduing her. Your writing hasn't improved, has it? Edward Harrington examined the ink blots on the paper, feigning a sigh. If I hadn't seen it myself, who would believe my ethereal Margaret could produce such a mess? Truly, appearances can be deceiving. What about your writing? Mine is beautiful. It's just that the characters here are too complicated, and the brush is unwieldy. I can't showcase my true skill. Margaret Harrington retorted, a hint of annoyance in her voice. Is that so? Edward Harrington chuckled. Humph. Margaret Harrington grabbed a brush and snapped it in two. Margaret, Edward Harrington was puzzled. Was she upset because he laughed at her writing, taking her anger out on the brush? Knife. Margaret Harrington demanded, hand outstretched. Edward Harrington was completely lost. The dagger. Margaret Harrington emphasized. Though bewildered, Edward Harrington obeyed his beloved, producing the dagger he always carried. Margaret Harrington snatched it, discarding the ornate sheath, and proceeded to whittle the broken brush with the blade. Edward Harrington was dumbfounded. Daggers weren't for this. They were for protection, for killing, not for woodworking. Margaret Harrington sharpened the brush to a fine point, then tossed the dagger aside, satisfied. Dipping her makeshift pen in ink, she began to write on the chien paper. Are these your era's characters? Edward Harrington asked, surprised by the simplified script. Yes. What do you think? Your writing truly isn't that bad. Edward Harrington declared after a long pause, studying the characters. Though not exquisite, they flowed with an unrestrained ease, far surpassing anything written with a brush. Margaret Harrington shot him a look. This man didn't even know how to give a compliment. These three characters are Edward Harrington. Quite simplified, but I can make out the meaning. Yes. Margaret Harrington nodded. The characters you use now are like its ancestors. It's been simplified over thousands of years. That's why the characters here have a similar form. It's also why I can read the books here but can't write the characters. Looking at the writing from thousands of years in the future, a wave of unease washed over Edward Harrington. He tightened his embrace, holding the small woman close. Hearing her speak of her time created a chasm between them, a fear that she might vanish in the next instant, never to be seen again. The thought terrified him. What's wrong? Sensing the tightening grip on her waist and the change in his breathing, Margaret Harrington tilted her head, questioning. Margaret, Edward Harrington said, let's have a child. A child, a bond. I won't have to worry about you leaving me one day. You love children so much, let's have one. One that looks like both of us. He kissed her smooth, beautiful cheek, his voice filled with longing. Margaret Harrington stiffened, silent, not even protesting his possessive demand. Children. To her, it was a distant concept. She loved children, but she had never considered having her own. More accurately, she didn't dare to. Her own mother was a mistress, giving birth to her solely to extort money. After getting the money, she abandoned Margaret as a child on the streets. Having lived a life on the edge, constantly facing danger, she had never entertained the thought of having children. She carried the same reckless blood as her mother, fearing she might one day mistreat her own child, hurt them. Therefore, the idea of having children was something she never dared to touch. Chapter 43, Ladder of Death. Margaret Harrington awoke drowsily as the day neared noon. After washing her face, she leaned wearily against the chaise lounge and said indifferently, "Lillian Moore, where's the medicine?" Lillian Moore hesitated, her large eyes flickering with reluctance, but finally she obediently replied, "Miss, it's ready." "Yes." Margaret Harrington closed her eyes and said lazily, "Bring it here." Hearing this, Lillian Moore left the bedroom and a moment later returned with a steaming bowl of medicine. Margaret Harrington sat up slightly and as she took the bowl, she noticed Lillian Moore seemed to want to say something but hesitated. "What's wrong? Is something the matter?" she asked, looking at Lillian Moore. "Miss." Lillian Moore bit her lip, finally seeming to make up her mind. "Miss. His Royal Highness dotes on you, indulging your every whim. Why do you still take this medicine? Do you not care for His Royal Highness?" Margaret Harrington's hand holding the medicine bowl trembled slightly, 1,000 thoughts flashing through her mind in an instant, almost causing her to drop the bowl. She looked up at Lillian Moore, whose innocent, wide eyes were looking at her with doubt and expectation, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. Finally, with a complex look in her eyes, she said, "You wouldn't understand these matters. But Lillian Moore knows His Royal Highness truly adores Miss." Slightly disappointed by her mistress's answer, Lillian Moore hurriedly exclaimed, "Lillian Moore can see it, His Royal Highness truly loves and cherishes Mississippi. Do you not have any feelings for him at all? His Royal Highness longs for a child, why do you take this medicine? If His Royal Highness finds out, how will he treat you? Miss, Lillian Moore is truly worried, please don't take this medicine anymore, all right?" By the end, her voice was almost pleading. Looking at the worried Lillian Moore before her, Margaret Harrington remained silent. How could she explain to this sincere maid? Tell her that she wasn't ready, that she lacked the confidence to care for a child properly? Or tell her that she didn't trust the love of a prince in this ancient era, unsure how long it could last? Even Edward Harrington might not understand her anxieties, let alone this naive girl. Forget it, there was no point in saying anything. "You may leave. I know what I'm doing, don't worry," she said. Lillian Moore looked at the medicine bowl in her hand, her lips moving as if she wanted to advise her again, but in the end, she remained silent and quietly withdrew. Staring at the steaming medicine bowl in her hand for a long time, she finally decided to drink it. "My dear child, it's not that I don't want you, but I'm just not ready yet." The moment the bowl touched her lips, a sudden incident occurred. The medicine bowl was snatched from her hand. Looking up in astonishment, she met Edward Harrington's furious face. "What is this?" he roared, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale. Caught like this, Margaret Harrington panicked slightly, momentarily unsure how to react, just staring blankly at him. Edward Harrington slammed the medicine bowl down on the table with a bang and shouted towards the back, "Someone, check this for me, what kind of medicine is this?" "Why?" "Your Royal Highness," a trembling voice answered from behind, followed by an elderly wet nurse stepping forward, her legs unsteady. Recovering from her surprise, Margaret Harrington saw several maids following behind Edward Harrington, including Helena. As soon as she approached the table and took a sniff, the wet nurse knelt down in terror, trembling. Your Royal Highness. What is it? Edward Harrington's deep voice echoed, causing those around him to shudder. It's a contraceptive potion. Finally managing to speak, the wet nurse knelt on the ground, trembling, fearing that the enraged prince would strike her dead with a single blow. A contraceptive potion. Humph. Edward Harrington sneered, the air around him turning chillingly cold, making people's hair stand on end. He closed his eyes in pain, and when he opened them, they were icy, his gaze like daggers piercing the unsuspecting Margaret Harrington. From his mouth, he slowly uttered a few words, "All of you, get out." His voice was soft, yet it carried the breath of death from hell. Although he was looking at Margaret Harrington, his words were clearly directed at the others. The wet nurse kneeling on the ground and the maids behind her, upon hearing this, scrambled out of the room as if granted amnesty, even conveniently slamming the bedroom door shut. Although they knew the princess would be punished, no one dared to linger. Because they knew how cruel and terrifying their master could be when enraged. Edward Harrington. Looking at the cold Edward Harrington, a sense of unease and fear suddenly arose in Margaret Harrington's heart, and she softly called his name. A contraceptive potion. Humph. Edward Harrington sneered, his eyes sharp. He suddenly grabbed her shoulders, pulling her up to face his deep, cold black eyes. So. Toying with me like a fool, it feels good, doesn't it? Edward Harrington. His fingers tightened painfully on her shoulders, making Margaret Harrington cry out in pain. She knew she had gone too far, that he would be very angry. But what did he mean? When had she ever toyed with him? You love him that much, that for him, you can be so heartless as to not want my child, and even play me for a fool? Edward Harrington stared into her eyes and asked. Deep within his cold gaze was boundless pain. Edward Harrington, what are you talking about? Margaret Harrington asked, slightly surprised. She just temporarily didn't want a child, it absolutely wasn't because of another man. Had he misunderstood something? Do you not understand what I'm saying? Saying you've forgotten him, saying you don't want to see him anymore, it turns out it was all a lie. You've never forgotten him. He tightened his grip on her shoulders and roared. No. I haven't. The pain in her shoulders made her almost faint, but she wanted to explain, never had she been so eager to do so. She didn't want him to misunderstand her. You still want to lie to me now? Edward Harrington roared, losing control, you've even taken the contraceptive potion, what else can you deny? No, listen to me. Listen to me. Margaret Harrington yelled, struggling to break free from his grip. Now she wanted to tell him her worries, hoping he could understand her concerns. But at this moment, Edward Harrington didn't give her the chance. You're a liar. I don't want to hear your lies anymore. Since you don't know what's good for you, don't blame me for being ruthless. Mad, truly mad. For this woman of unknown origin, he had acted like a fool, courting her, discarding his princely dignity to pamper her to the fullest. Unexpectedly, in return, he received her lies, her contraceptive potion. When Helena ran to his study to show him that painting, how astonished he had been. The man in the painting resembled Evan Gray, but was much gentler than him. She said she wanted to forget him, yet she secretly painted his portrait, gazing at it day after day. This made him incredibly furious. Not enough, when Helena told him that the princess, because she missed that man day and night, didn't want to bear his child and was taking a contraceptive potion, the nerves he had been trying to restrain completely snapped. Bringing along an elderly wet nurse, he rushed straight to Falling Leaf Pavilion. In his heart, there was still a sliver of hope, hoping Helena was lying, that she wasn't actually taking a contraceptive potion. That it was all a misunderstanding. But upon entering the bedroom, the sight that greeted him sent his heart plummeting to the 18th level of hell. He could forgive her for loving another man, he could forgive her for not having him in her heart, but he couldn't forgive her for gazing at that man's portrait every day while claiming to have forgotten him. He couldn't forgive her for disregarding his child for another man. This damned woman. Had he treated her too well, making her forget her place, cuckolding him? Fine. If she didn't know how to cherish it, then don't blame him for turning ruthless. Now, she finally witnessed the tyrannical duke spoken of in legends. It seemed she had always forgotten that the gentle and caring Edward Harrington also had a cruel, bloodthirsty side. This arrogant, conceited man couldn't tolerate defiance. Looking at this brutal man, she couldn't help but tremble, her eyes gradually filling with despair. So unfamiliar. This man was completely different from the Edward Harrington she knew, always cold but utterly protective of her. Was this what men were like? Possessing countless faces, no matter how perceptive you were, you could never fully see through them. Charles Stone was like that, and so was he. Consciousness gradually slipped away, she drifted in a chaotic haze, unaware of how many times she fainted, unaware of how many centuries passed before this brutal punishment ended. The man glanced at her contemptuously, coldly saying, "You don't want this duke's child? Then this duke will grant your wish." With that, he picked up the now cold bowl of medicine from the table, pinched her mouth open, and poured the medicine down her throat. "Since you don't want to be the Duchess, fine. Without this duke's permission, you are not to step foot outside the dukedom," he coldly declared, flicking his sleeves as he left the bedroom. A tear slipped from the corner of her eye, falling into her thick hair. Why were the men she loved so heartless? What had she done wrong? Margaret Harrington lay despairingly on the floor, her vacant eyes staring at the ceiling, motionless. The deep pain in her heart, who would pity? The myriad unanswered questions, who would give her the answers? Margaret Harrington fell ill. Margaret Harrington, who had never been sick in this life or the last, was easily struck down by illness, bedridden and unable to get up. Whether it was heartache or a ravaged body that couldn't take it anymore, she couldn't get up. Lying in the empty bedroom, her vacant eyes wide open, yet seeing nothing. Falling Lotus Pavilion now became a neglected cold palace, even more gloomy and desolate. Because of her plummeting status, the once bustling Falling Lotus Pavilion was left with only her and Lillian Moore. The once warm chambers became cold due to the lack of heating. Her illness lingered due to the lack of medicine. In reality, this minor cold was nothing to her. In her past life, she had endured countless wounds, even taking bullets without flinching. But this time, her heart was once again broken. The scene of that day kept replaying in her mind, Edward Harrington's ferocity, brutality, ruthlessness, his heartless words, like a sharp sword piercing her heart, blood flowing freely. Every thought brought another wave of pain. Yet, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She had thought she had let go of Charles Stone, that she wouldn't love him, only seeing him as a support in this world, her husband in name only. Now she realized that, unknowingly, he had entered her heart. She had unconsciously grown accustomed to his care, his protection, and his domineering words. But unexpectedly, the day she understood was the day it all ended. She had no happiness, only suffering and a broken heart. She truly was the most foolish woman in the world. She had clearly told herself not to love again, yet she couldn't help but fall into the net cast by this man, drowning in his gentle care. The mistakes of her past life, she continued to make in this one. She clearly knew that a man like him wouldn't easily say, "I love you," yet she still believed. She deserved it. Chapter 44, Sickness. She closed her eyes in pain. The future was bleak. Where could she go? Where could she find refuge, a place of tranquil peace? "Miss, useless Lillian Moore, I couldn't get the medicine, nor could I see His Royal Highness." Lillian Moore entered, kneeling by the bed, anxiously looking at Margaret Harrington lying motionless, sobbing, tears streaming down her cheeks. Touched by the maid's sincerity, Margaret Harrington sat up, leaning against the headboard. "Lillian Moore, don't look for medicine for me anymore. My illness is nothing. Days of silence had made her voice hoarse. Margaret Harrington's response made Lillian Moore cry with joy. That's wonderful, miss. You finally spoke. These past few days, you haven't said a word, you almost scared me to death. Lillian Moore only has miss as family, please don't leave me. You must get well soon. Her sincere words warmed Margaret Harrington's wounded heart. She smiled faintly. Don't worry, I won't abandon you. I still have to find Lillian Moore a good husband. For this naive, innocent girl, she had to live. Miss. Lillian Moore blushed, calling out coquettishly, with a maiden's shyness. What do you think of Steward Fu's son, Shui Zhen? Honest, kind, caring, very worthy of our Lillian Moore. She teased, knowing Lillian Moore liked the simple Shui general and he liked her, visiting often. Since she had been demoted to concubine, only he had dared to visit this cold palace. He was a good man, trustworthy. Miss, what are you saying? Shui Zhen. Shui Zhen. He. Lillian Moore. How could Lillian Moore be worthy of him? Lillian Moore blushed even more, stammering, forgetting her tears. Why not worthy? Our Lillian Moore is kind, gentle, beautiful, and generous. Marrying that rascal is a bargain for him. Margaret Harrington continued to tease. Miss. I'm not talking to you anymore. Lillian Moore, speechless, pouted and turned away. Margaret Harrington watched her with amusement, ceasing her teasing. A hint of envy flickered in her eyes. Being a simple maid was good, at least one man truly cared for her. Lillian Moore was a good girl, she would definitely marry her off to that fool. Miss, how is your illness? A moment later, Lillian Moore remembered the important matter, asking hurriedly. The miss was so annoying, only knowing how to tease her, making her forget about her illness. However, she was glad the miss was no longer ignoring her. Don't worry. It's just a minor ailment. I'll be fine in a few days. But miss, you've been lying down for days, not getting any better, but worse. Lillian Moore is really worried, but they won't give Lillian Moore any medicine. Helplessness clouded Lillian Moore's face. Hearing this, Margaret Harrington's heart ached. No medicine, was that his order? Truly a heartless emperor, one moment solicitous, the next able to watch her starve to death. Miss, people are saying, that you, have another man in your heart. Is that why you don't want children? Is that why His Royal Highness treats you this way? Seeing Margaret Harrington's silence, Lillian Moore voiced her doubts. She hadn't forgotten the miss's appearance 3 days ago, lying on the ground, covered in injuries, eyes vacant, nearly scaring her to death. That day, His Royal Highness demoted her to concubine and hadn't set foot here since. Lillian Moore saw, His Royal Highness was truly furious. Lillian Moore, these things are no longer important. Looking at the question in Lillian Moore's bright eyes, Margaret Harrington shook her head. Though she hadn't been outside, she was sure rumors about her were rampant. But she felt no need to explain. How can it not be important? Miss, Lillian Moore believes His Royal Highness is in your heart. Just tell him, and he will forgive you. Lillian Moore said urgently. She didn't dare tell the miss that His Royal Highness now spent his days at the floating cloud pavilion, amusing himself with other women. Forgiveness? Laughable. Had she done wrong? Before, she might have felt a little guilty towards him, but not now. She should thank that cup of poisoned wine for revealing his cruel, heartless nature. Margaret Harrington, intelligent as she was, naturally understood they had been schemed against, leading to these misunderstandings. But if this man had trusted her even a little, things wouldn't have come to this. Who was behind it no longer mattered, she had seen this man's heartlessness, knew he wasn't her soulmate, and that was enough. Lillian Moore, I'm tired. You may leave. Yes, Mississippi. Lillian Moore replied, disappointed, helping her lie down, covering her with a blanket, then withdrawing. Closing her eyes, Margaret Harrington couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, disturbing her peace. Suddenly aware of an unusual presence, she opened her eyes warily. Who's there? Before the bed stood a middle-aged man in green, his expression cold, yet filled with love and distress as he looked at her. Godfather? She called out in surprise, struggling to sit up. Seeing this, the man quickly pressed her down, chiding gently, lie still. Godfather, why are you here? She lay back obediently, asking. Such a big thing happened to you, how could I not come? A few days ago, I heard you obtained the soul-chasing zither and were favored by Edward Harrington. I was happy for you. How did things change so quickly? Why did Edward Harrington strip you of your title and banish you to this cold palace? Victor Blackwell asked anxiously. Margaret Harrington's eyes darkened, pain welling up. Seeing her anguish, Victor Blackwell couldn't bear to press further. He sighed. They say emperors are heartless, and it's true. Margaret, Edward Harrington is not a good man, don't grieve for him. In a few days, shall I take you away? This wretched place holds nothing worth clinging to. Looking at her godfather's anger, warmth filled her heart. Someone in this world still cared for her, even if that care was meant for Rose's daughter, but she was the one receiving it now, wasn't she? Godfather, I'm fine, don't worry. She comforted him, then added with concern, this royal palace has eyes and ears everywhere. Coming here, aren't you in danger? Victor. Blackwell snorted disdainfully. They're not capable of capturing me. Margaret, what's wrong with you? Is it serious? You've lost so much weight. He asked, his concern evident. It's nothing, just a cold. I'll be fine in a few days. Let me see. He took Margaret Harrington's right hand, checking her pulse. After a moment, he frowned, then placed his hand on her palm. Margaret Harrington, surprised by his action, felt a warmth flow from his palm, warm and comforting, spreading through her body. She closed her eyes, savoring the sensation. After a while, Victor Blackwell stopped. How do you feel? Refreshed. Good. Sleep well, and you'll recover. Knowing he was using his internal energy to heal her, she smiled gratefully. Thank you, Godfather. This royal palace is no good place. Seeing you here, I'm uneasy. I wasn't prepared this time, but next time, shall I take you away? He frowned, his face worried, finally voicing his decision. Godfather, if I want to leave, no one can stop me. It's just that I don't want to leave yet. Margaret Harrington thought for a moment, then spoke. She knew that getting her out of the heavily guarded Harrington Manor wouldn't be easy, and she didn't want to implicate him. Furthermore, although disappointed and heartbroken, she wasn't ready to run away. She wanted a clear answer. Did he have feelings for her or not? Charles Stone deceived her for revenge, but what about him? Was it simply to conquer a woman, to satisfy male vanity? Victor Blackwell looked at her for a long time, seeing the determination in her eyes, and finally sighed, offering no further persuasion. I won't interfere in matters of the heart, but I've heard Edward Harrington heartless is ruthless and cruel. It's best not to place too much hope in him. Also, this is a signal flare. If you're ever in real danger, fire it. I'll have people watching out. The Shadow Gang isn't to be trifled with, and we don't fear this little royal mansion. He took out a small bamboo tube and handed it to her, instructing her on its use. Unable to refuse his kindness, Margaret Harrington accepted it, gratefully saying, "Thank you, Godfather." Whether she used it or not, it represented a loved one's concern, and she was deeply grateful. And one more thing, he pulled a book from his sleeve and gave it to her. I know you have the soul-chasing zither. It's a rare and powerful weapon, but without martial arts skills or internal energy, you can't unleash its full potential. This is the Jade Maiden Heart Sutra, suitable for women to cultivate. Practice it in your free time. A little internal energy for self-defense will be beneficial. Jade Maiden Heart Sutra. She curiously took it and flipped through the pages, seeing that it was mostly internal energy cultivation techniques, along with some simple martial arts moves. She couldn't help but feel excited. She had long wanted to practice martial arts here, only by becoming strong could she avoid being controlled by others. But previously, she hadn't had the opportunity and had been blinded by Edward Harrington's protection, not paying attention to it. Unexpectedly, her godfather had thought of her. "Don't worry, godfather, I will practice diligently." "Good. Rest well then, I'll be going. Take good care of yourself." He carefully tucked the blanket around her. "Yes. Be careful, godfather." He nodded, gave her another lingering look, and then, just like last time, vanished in the blink of an eye. Only the window swayed slightly. Watching her godfather leave, Margaret Harrington clutched the Jade Maiden Heart Sutra and the small bamboo tube to her chest, feeling a warmth spread through her. The gloom of the past few days lifted considerably. She had never experienced paternal love in her previous life, but unexpectedly, she had found it in this one. It was truly heartwarming. Curled up in the blankets, she slept soundly, waking up in the middle of the night. The room was unlit, pitch black. Touching her forehead, she found the fever had subsided. It seemed her godfather's methods were very effective. Feeling a little hungry, she pulled back the covers and was about to get out of bed to find something to eat when she suddenly heard footsteps outside the door. She quickly lay back down, pulled the covers over herself, and closed her eyes, pretending to be asleep. Soon, she heard the door softly open and close. Someone lightly entered, and from the sound of the footsteps, it was a man. Margaret Harrington frowned inwardly, wondering which daring man would enter her room in the middle of the night. But quickly, as the man sat down beside her bed, a familiar scent reached her nose, and she knew who it was. It was Edward Harrington. His scent was so familiar that she recognized him instantly. But this realization filled her with both suspicion and astonishment. What was he doing here in the dead of night? Wasn't he supposed to be spending his nights in blissful embrace? Why would he come to this desolate place to see a woman he loathed? Hadn't he hurt her enough, and now he was back to inflict another blow? In the darkness, Edward Harrington gazed intently at her sleeping face, at her beautiful features, unable to tear his eyes away. His spies had told him she was ill, yet he had been heartless enough to ignore her. He had thought he would quickly forget such a stubborn and daring woman, but night after night, lingering in the floating cloud pavilion, surrounded by beautiful women, he couldn't erase her cool, beautiful face from his mind. While embracing other women, her face would flash before his eyes. He was going mad, he realized he was truly losing his mind. This woman, for another man, had disregarded his child and lied to him. He hated her, yet he couldn't bring himself to harm her. The last time he had punished her so cruelly, seeing her pale, lifeless face as he left, he had felt a pang of guilt, a sense that he had been too harsh. God, he felt less and less like himself. Just like tonight, he had woken from a dream and couldn't control his feet, unknowingly arriving here. Looking at her, his heart felt full, at ease. He hadn't seen her for a few days, and she seemed to have lost a lot of weight. Was it because she was ill? Chapter 45, Heart of Ice. He placed a hand on her forehead, relieved to find she wasn't feverish. Her sleeping face was beautiful, but her brows were furrowed, as if troubled even in her dreams. She rarely smiled, seemingly burdened by countless worries, never experiencing a moment of peace. This thought pained him, and he gently touched the space between her eyebrows, hoping to dispel her melancholy. Just as he was carefully stroking her brow, Margaret Harrington suddenly opened her eyes. They shone brightly in the darkness, fixed on him with a cold stare. Edward Harrington's hand froze, and he awkwardly withdrew it, the tenderness in his eyes vanishing as he returned her cold gaze. Sensing his burning gaze and gentle touch, Margaret Harrington couldn't hold back any longer. Disgusted by his pretense and unable to understand his true intentions, she had opened her eyes. Seeing the tenderness in his gaze, she was momentarily surprised. Could his feelings for her be genuine? But in the next instant, his expression turned cold, as if the previous gentleness was merely her illusion. She returned his cold stare. Whether his feelings were real or not, she couldn't forgive the hurt he had inflicted upon her that day. "What are you doing here?" After a long silence, Margaret Harrington spoke first, her voice cold and questioning. Edward Harrington, angered, replied coldly, "This is the royal residence. I can go wherever I please, without needing a reason." Perhaps feeling at a disadvantage sitting by her bed, he stood up, looking down at her. "How are you finding your days in the cold palace? Getting used to it yet?" He sneered, "No matter who you are, your fate here is decided by me. I can grant you riches and honor, or I can crush you beneath my feet. If you came here just to say these things, fine, you've said them. You can leave now." Margaret Harrington looked at him coldly. Edward Harrington's face darkened. He gripped her chin, lifting her face, and said furiously, "What a sharp tongue. Were you this defiant in front of that other man?" Margaret Harrington remained silent, only staring coldly at him. Looking at her stubborn face, Edward Harrington gradually calmed down. His other hand gently caressed her cheek as he said softly, "Do you realize your mistake?" If she admitted her fault, he was willing to give her a chance. After all, that other man was her past, and he could overlook it. Moreover, her every move stirred his heart, making him reluctant to let her go. Margaret Harrington suddenly flung his hand away, escaping his grasp, and retreated, glaring at him. "I did nothing wrong," she said coldly. "You did nothing wrong." Edward Harrington roared in anger. "You are my princess, yet you think of another man and refuse to bear my children. Such treason and disobedience, and you say you did nothing wrong. I am not thinking of another man. And whether or not I have children is my business. I don't want to have them, so I won't. What's wrong with that? Your Highness has countless beauties. You can have children with whomever you please. Don't come demanding it of me." She didn't show any weakness. "Fine, very well." Edward Harrington's face turned purple, his fists clenched. He wanted to strike her, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. "I won't beg you to bear my children. Countless women would gladly do so. Since you're so stubborn, then just die of old age here." He roared, then turned and left without looking back. Watching his retreating figure, a wave of disappointment washed over Margaret Harrington. She didn't understand his purpose in coming. Was it just to argue with her? Why did his behavior tonight seem to suggest he cared for her? Was it an illusion? He had treated her well before, but now? She couldn't understand his thoughts anymore. Nor could she understand her own heart. Love? Or not love? What a difficult question. After Edward Harrington left, Margaret Harrington lay on her bed, staring at the dark ceiling, her heart aching. She didn't know how to describe this feeling. She had been hungry, but now she had lost her appetite. Edward Harrington's handsome, emotionless face appeared before her eyes. The fleeting tenderness on his face, his smile, his forgiving and compassionate gaze. And also the occasional loneliness and pain he revealed. She didn't know when she had memorized his every expression, but she couldn't deny the stirring in her heart. She had fallen for him. But did he deserve her love? A man raised in the dark confines of the palace, surrounded by women since childhood, a man accustomed to struggle, accustomed to schemes and plots, did he even understand what love was? How long could his love last? Today he could torment her over a bowl of contraceptive soup, what about tomorrow? What would he do to push her to her death next? A weak woman like her, without power, without influence, without martial arts skills, how many more times could she endure his wrath? She tossed and turned until dawn. Lillian Moore came in to help her wash, then brought her a simple meal. She ate a few bites, then lost her appetite. After sitting listlessly in her room for half a day, she restlessly walked out the door, her first time leaving Falling Lotus Pavilion since the tension between them had escalated. Falling Lotus Pavilion had no guards, but she knew how many eyes were watching her in the shadows. Fortunately, Edward Harrington hadn't completely imprisoned her, at least within the royal residence, she could still move freely. The residence was vast, and she hadn't brought Lillian Moore with her, nor did she know her way around. She wandered aimlessly, sticking to less traveled paths. It was already December, and the temperature was very low. Despite wearing a thick cotton coat, she still felt the chill. Fortunately, it was a sunny day, and the sunlight felt warm on her skin. After walking for a while, a rock garden appeared before her. Dense and jagged, it seemed strangely out of place within the royal residence. Looking at the rock garden, Margaret Harrington felt a sense of familiarity. As she strolled among the dense rocks, the feeling of familiarity intensified. She furrowed her brow, thinking for a moment, then suddenly remembered she had been here before. It was the night of the Mid-Autumn Festival. She had heard strange sounds and seen strange things in this rock garden. She was certain that this rock garden held some of Edward Harrington's hidden secrets. After touching the cold rocks for a while, she turned back. She had been out for quite some time. If she didn't return, Lillian Moore would worry. In this vast royal residence, only that silly maid truly cared for her. Slightly lost, she had difficulty finding her way back. Finally reaching the main garden of the residence, she breathed a sigh of relief. She had finally found the right path. Looking around the vast garden, her eyes were suddenly drawn to a vibrant corner in the distance. It was a plum grove, blooming brilliantly amidst the desolate winter landscape, even more splendid under the sunlight. Such a wonderful place existed within the royal residence. Her feet unconsciously carried her towards it. Stepping into the plum grove, stroking the crimson blossoms on the branches, she couldn't help but smile. Such resilient flowers, blooming in the cold winter, exuding a fragrant aroma, adding beauty to the bleak season. How dreary winter would be without them. I truly adore His Highness. I am his in life, his in death. I will be loyal to him for all eternity. Lost in admiring the plum blossoms, she suddenly heard a woman's voice coming from deep within the grove, sweet, soft, and seductive. And somewhat familiar. Margaret Harrington frowned slightly, unconsciously stepping deeper into the plum grove. Deep within the grove was a pavilion, a fireplace burning within. In the center of the pavilion was a stone table, laden with snacks and several jugs of wine. At this moment, an incomparably handsome man sat in the pavilion, holding a wine cup, his cold eyes fixed on the liquid within. But in the man's arms lay a woman dressed as a servant girl. Seemingly oblivious to his indifferent expression, her soft hands caressed his chest, her red lips whispering words of love. "My lord, I will forever be yours, never wanting to leave your side." She spoke with affection, and seeing no reaction, she boldly kissed his cheek. The man snapped back, his deep eyes coldly regarding the woman in his embrace. She blushed, her cheeks crimson, her red lips slightly parted as she shyly buried her face in his chest. The fire within him ignited. Draining his wine cup and tossing it aside, he pressed her down, kissing her passionately. This scene chilled Margaret Harrington to the bone. She turned and walked away, her footsteps light, making no sound, not disturbing the entangled couple. Emerging from the apricot forest, she stumbled towards Falling Lotus Pavilion as if pursued by a wild beast. She found it ludicrous, utterly ludicrous. That she had fallen for such a man was unforgivable. She had lived for over 30 years, encountered all sorts of men, yet she had fallen for such a scoundrel, truly regressing with age. That woman was Helena, a common servant girl. Yet, she had ensnared her, quickly hooking Edward Harrington. How impressive! Her heart was icy, her entire body cold. Reaching Falling Lotus Pavilion, she gasped for breath, leaning against the door. "Miss, you're finally back." Lillian Moore was so worried. Miss, why are you crying?" Lillian Moore, waiting inside, breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing her return. Noticing the tears streaming down her face, she fell silent, asking with surprise and concern. "Crying?" Margaret Harrington touched her face in confusion, indeed finding it wet. It's nothing." She hastily wiped away her tears, telling Lillian Moore, "You can go. I'm a bit tired and want to rest." "Yes, Mississippi." Then Lillian Moore will take her leave. "If you need anything, just call." Despite her worry, seeing Margaret Harrington's resolute gaze, Lillian Moore obediently withdrew. When her mistress was happy, she could chat with her, but when she wasn't, a single glance was enough to frighten her. How could she dare disobey? Lately, her mistress hadn't been in a good mood, so it was best not to speak too much. After Lillian Moore left, Margaret Harrington dried her tears, scolding herself. Only after regaining her composure did she retrieve the Jade Maiden's Heart Sutra from under her pillow, reading intently. It was already December, nearing the new year. Falling Lotus Pavilion remained as desolate and cold as ever, devoid of any festive atmosphere. Since encountering Edward Harrington in the apricot forest that day, Margaret Harrington hadn't stepped foot outside, and Edward Harrington hadn't visited either, as if he had forgotten this little corner. In the entire vast courtyard, only she and Lillian Moore remained. But Margaret Harrington didn't find it bothersome. The lack of disturbance was convenient for her practice of martial arts and the zither. The Jade Maiden's Heart Sutra was truly suitable for her. In a short time, she had sensed a flow of energy circulating within her dantian. It was likely what people called internal energy. Her playing of the soul-chasing zither became more proficient, and she could even utilize her internal energy. She just didn't know how potent it was. She no longer thought of Charles Stone or Edward Harrington. It seemed her life was fated to be without men. She had lost hope. Thinking of nothing, focusing on martial arts, such days were actually quite good. Edward Harrington's treatment of her wasn't bad, at least she had food and clothing, not to the point of starvation. Having food, no worries, no need for bloodshed, such a life was once beyond her dreams. Now she had it all, albeit after a heartbreak, but as long as she didn't think about it, she was content with this life. Chapter 46, The Emperor arrives that afternoon. The sun blazed brilliantly. After practicing the Jade Maiden Heart Sutra for a while, Margaret Harrington took her soul-chasing zither and prepared to go outside to play. Just as she opened the door, she saw a man enter Falling Lotus Pavilion. The man, dressed in a yellow robe, was tall and handsome, accompanied by a small eunuch. Margaret Harrington stood still at the doorway, while Lillian Moore fearfully knelt, stammering, Your Majesty." James Harrington walked up to Margaret Harrington, his expression complex as he looked at her and said, "Margaret, I want to talk to you." "Lillian Moore, you may leave first." Margaret Harrington said to Lillian Moore. Lillian Moore obediently retreated to her room. James Harrington also dismissed his attendant. In an instant, only the two of them remained in the spacious courtyard. Margaret Harrington carried the soul-chasing zither to the stone table in the courtyard, placed it on the table, and said coldly, "Your Majesty, please be seated." Because Margaret Harrington loved basking in the sun in the courtyard, there were two bamboo chairs beside the stone table, with soft cushions spread on them. Margaret Harrington sat down on one chair, and James Harrington followed suit. "I didn't expect you to come." Margaret Harrington began, "May I ask what brings you here?" "Margaret, I came today to see you. I heard that you and Howe are having a disagreement. How have you been lately?" James Harrington looked at her and asked. "Very well." Margaret Harrington smiled faintly and replied. James Harrington looked at her for a long time before saying, "My brother, although a bit hot-tempered, is a good person. I can see that he truly loves you. He's lost a lot of weight recently, and he's been distracted and hasty in everything he does, even during court sessions. I know it's all because of you. Although he appears indifferent on the surface, he values relationships deeply. I know you're not an ordinary woman, but I hope you'll give him a chance, be a little more forgiving. Don't let him suffer like this anymore. He has suffered enough, and I hope someone will truly treat him well and make him happy." Margaret Harrington looked at the handsome young emperor in front of her in astonishment. She really didn't expect him to say these words. "Why are you looking at me like that?" James Harrington, seeing her incredulous gaze, was a little puzzled. "Don't people say that royalty is devoid of father-son affection and brotherly love? Why are you so good to him?" Margaret Harrington asked suspiciously. James Harrington chuckled softly. "Perhaps royalty has always been like this, everyone in the royal family is heartless. But we are different. Hao is the only brother I acknowledge. He has always been sincere with me, fighting on the battlefield, protecting the kingdom, and saving my life countless times. He's truly pitiful, having endured so much hardship. As his elder brother, I hope he can live well. You seem to be a good brother. But, what good does it do to tell me these things? I'm just one of his women. Does my attitude matter to him? It matters." James Harrington said very seriously, "In the days when you two were happy, I could see him smile, a truly joyful smile. Honestly, I've rarely seen him smile since we were young. You can make him smile, which proves you are very important to him. But now, he's back to his old self, expressionless, cold eyes, even more so than before, indulging in wine and women for days. That's why I came to see you, hoping you two can reconcile." Margaret Harrington was silent for a moment before raising her head to look at James Harrington and asking, "Do you have someone in your heart?" "Someone in my heart?" James Harrington was taken aback, murmuring, "Yes, someone in your heart. You would care for her, love her, always think of her. A day without seeing her feels like 3 years, brave fire and bullets for her, even risk your life. Have you ever?" James Harrington was silent for a moment. He had many concubines in his harem, but no woman had ever made him feel this conflicted. He couldn't imagine such a situation. "Does it matter if I have or not?" Finally, he asked. "Of course, it matters." Margaret Harrington looked directly into James Harrington's eyes and said seriously, "If you've ever truly loved someone, you'll understand this feeling. You only want to hold hands with the person you love, live until your hair turns white, and never betray your lover, neither physically nor emotionally. Even if 100 flowers bloom in the world, she is the only one I love. Among 3,000 streams of water, I only take one ladle. That is my ideal of love. If I can't achieve it, I'd rather have nothing. Your Majesty, do you think Edward Harrington is my destined one? Is this the reason you don't want to bear his children?" James Harrington, hearing such an ideal of love for the first time, was somewhat stunned. After a long while, he regained his composure and asked, "But you're already married to Hao, you can only be his for the rest of your life. Isn't he your destined one? Is that so?" Margaret Harrington smirked sarcastically. Then she suddenly said, "I've been practicing the zither for a long time. Are you interested in hearing a piece?" James Harrington couldn't switch his thoughts immediately, but he still nodded. "I'd be honored to listen." Slender fingers glided over the strings, and a melodious, sentimental tune slowly sounded, filling the courtyard. James Harrington wanted to ask her about her and Edward Harrington, but seeing her so focused, he didn't want to disturb her. He could only sit opposite her and listen to her wonderful playing. The melody was gentle and affectionate, like a lover's whisper, telling of vows of eternal love, beautiful and moving. James Harrington was immersed in the wonderful music, comfortably closing his eyes. Unexpectedly, in the midst of the melody, the tune suddenly changed, becoming high-pitched and mournful, like a woman's scream, lamenting a man's betrayal. The music was filled with resentment and hatred, sending chills down one's spine. James Harrington suddenly opened his eyes and saw Margaret Harrington playing the zither with lightning speed. Her eyes revealed pain, despair, and hatred, which greatly surprised him, and even a hint of fear suddenly arose in his heart. He suddenly realized that this woman harbored many secrets and sorrows within her, very dangerous, and he didn't understand her at all. The emperor in the courtyard was extremely astonished, while the blue-robed man standing silently outside Falling Lotus Pavilion was in deep anguish. He had heard this tune countless times, and every time it felt like a knife cutting through his heart. Who was the man who betrayed her? Why was she still unable to forget him while she was in his mansion, as his woman, Edward Harrington's? When would his existence appear in her music? Time flowed slowly like sand in an hourglass. In the blink of an eye, it was mid-December, and the new year was approaching. These days, Margaret Harrington was busy practicing her skills and playing the zither, so she didn't feel the time dragging on. She had always been obediently staying within Falling Lotus Pavilion, but unexpectedly, today, a few uninvited guests arrived. "Ladies, my mistress is resting and it's inconvenient to see guests. Please wait a moment, I'll go in and announce your arrival." In front of the Falling Lotus Pavilion bedroom door, Lillian Moore blocked several gaudily dressed women who were aggressively approaching. "Resting? Resting at this hour? Putting on airs, isn't she?" A shrill female voice rang out. "That's right, she still thinks she's the princess consort. She doesn't even think about it, now she's just a disgraced concubine. And she dares to be arrogant in front of us." Another woman echoed. "Please calm down, ladies." Lillian Moore smiled apologetically and explained, "My mistress has caught a cold these past few days, she's not feeling well, so she's resting. Why don't you ladies go back first? I'll definitely tell my mistress, and she'll come to pay her respects when she's free." Slap. A slap landed on Lillian Moore's face, and the leading woman, with a gloomy expression, said, "Lillian Moore, is there a place for you to speak here? Call that woman out. After all, I served her for a while, let us meet and chat." "Helena, you." Lillian Moore held her face, glared at the culprit, and was so angry that she couldn't speak. "Impudent. Helena isn't a name a lowly servant like you can utter." Helena snapped, her face haughty. You. Lillian Moore was so furious she couldn't speak, only glaring at her. "What? This wench wants to rebel. Infuriate me, and I'll have the prince send you to a brothel." Helena threatened fiercely. "Why is it so lively here today?" A cold voice suddenly echoed, followed by the door opening to reveal Margaret Harrington in a blue dress, her beauty devastating, her aura noble, like a celestial being. "My lady!" Lillian Moore cried out pitifully upon seeing her, then hurried to her side. The three women accompanying Helena to Falling Lotus Pavilion had never met the former princess who resided there. Today, witnessing her exquisite beauty and noble aura, they were momentarily stunned. They had only heard that the princess consort was the most beautiful woman in the Windcloud Empire, but they never imagined she was this breathtaking. Princess consort. "Oh, no, you're no longer the princess consort, just a concubine, the same status as us, I can't address you like that anymore." Helena stepped forward, feigning a smile, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "What brings you here?" Margaret Harrington asked coldly. She didn't want to see this loathsome woman. Just thinking about that scene in the plum forest made her nauseous. "It's almost New Year's, naturally, I'm here to visit elder sister." Helena said with a smile, "The prince spends every night with us, elder sister must be lonely, sleeping under a single, cold blanket, so Helena came to comfort elder sister." "Thank you for your kindness, now you can leave." Margaret Harrington said coldly, her heart filled with disgust. These women were so annoying. How can elder sister chase us away? We still have so much to tell you. A woman in a pink dress beside Helena chimed in. Margaret Harrington shot her a cold glance, causing her to shiver involuntarily, retreating a step behind Helena, not daring to raise her head. Helena glared fiercely at the timid woman, then turned to Margaret Harrington. Indeed, elder sister, Helena still has something to tell you. Margaret Harrington looked at her coldly, saying nothing. She just didn't understand why Helena, having gotten her wish in Edward Harrington's favor, was still coming to bother her. Moreover, her eyes seemed to hold a deep resentment. Seeing her silence, Helena continued, unfazed, elder sister, do you know? Helena is carrying the prince's child, it's been over a month. She gently caressed her belly, looking at Margaret Harrington, see how much Helena cares for elder sister. I'm pregnant, and haven't even told the prince yet, but came to tell elder sister first. I thought, elder sister loves children so much, you'll definitely love the child in your younger sister's belly. Margaret Harrington's eyes darkened, then returned to normal, looking at the deceitful woman before her, she said coldly, don't call me with such saccharine sweetness, I have no younger sister. Humph. Helena's face darkened, revealing her true colors, her eyes filled with hatred as she said, do you think you're still the high and mighty princess consort? Don't forget, now you're just a discarded concubine. The prince won't need you anymore, give up. Now that I'm pregnant, this will be the prince's first child, and when the child is born, the position of princess consort will be mine. Don't think I'm still the maid serving you, I will be the mistress of the prince's mansion, just you wait and see. She hated this woman. Originally a cripple scorned by everyone in the Didi kingdom, why did she ascend to become the princess consort? Even more infuriating, she possessed such breathtaking beauty, effortlessly obtained the coveted soul-chasing zither, and captured the prince's heart. Although the prince had demoted her to a concubine, he still couldn't forget this woman. Every time he made love to her, he called out this woman's name. How could she not hate her? Then be your princess consort, I wish you luck. Margaret Harrington said coldly. With that, she turned to return to her room. Chapter 47, Terrifying Secret. Suddenly, a flurry of footsteps echoed, and Margaret Harrington looked up to see Edward Harrington, clad in blue robes, hurrying into the Falling Lotus Pavilion courtyard. He seemed deeply worried, his cold face etched with anxiety, but upon seeing her, he visibly relaxed, his expression softening. However, when his gaze fell upon the women facing Margaret Harrington, his face darkened again. He'd lost weight. That was Margaret Harrington's first thought upon seeing him. But she quickly turned away, unwilling to face him. Seeing her reaction, Edward Harrington's face paled further. Your Highness! Helena cried, rushing into his arms. Your Highness, I'm pregnant. Edward Harrington, about to pull her away, froze at her words. He instinctively glanced at Margaret Harrington. Her cold indifference sparked both anger and pain within him. He embraced Helena tightly, speaking gently, really? That's wonderful. I'm going to be a father. This calls for a 3-day celebration. Let's go, it's cold out here, don't catch a chill. Though his words were directed at Helena, his eyes remained fixed on Margaret Harrington, making her deeply uncomfortable. Thank you for your concern, Your Highness. Helena, blushing, buried her face in Edward Harrington's chest, smiling sweetly. Let's go. Edward Harrington gave Margaret Harrington one last, lingering look before carrying Helena away. The 3 other women obediently followed behind them. Margaret Harrington watched his retreating figure, a bitter ache in her heart. He had once been this tender with her, now he bestowed that tenderness upon another. How quickly things changed. But she didn't know that, upon leaving the Falling Lotus Pavilion, Edward Harrington shoved Helena away, delivering a stinging slap. The final look Edward Harrington had given her earlier had unsettled her deeply. It was a complex, profound gaze filled with disappointment, anger, sorrow, and a hint of dominance, a look that continued to haunt her. He wanted her to know that there were plenty of women vying to bear his children, that she wasn't special. He wanted her to regret her actions. But did she regret them? Perhaps a little, but given the choice, she would do it all again. Children were the crystallization of a parent's love, meant to be cherished and protected. Without certainty of his love, she wouldn't bear his child. She knew the suffering of a child without parents and wouldn't bring an innocent soul into such a world. Whether anyone understood or not, she would stand by her decision. As the candles burned down and the moon rose high, sleep evaded her. Lying in bed, she gazed at the full moon through the window, so clear and beautiful. For some reason, it brought to mind the bright moon of the Mid-Autumn Festival, equally clear and beautiful. Then, remembering the strange sights and sounds of that night, she abruptly sat up, deciding to investigate. For an assassin, gathering information was second nature. But since arriving here, she had rarely acted. Curious about her current skills, she donned her pre-prepared nightclothes and quietly slipped out of the Falling Lotus Pavilion. After the Emperor's arrival, the hidden eyes within the Falling Lotus Pavilion had diminished considerably, making her task easier. Reaching the rock garden, she hid behind a rock formation, carefully surveying the area below. As expected, she saw the stone door from her memory, guarded by two masked figures in black. There were no guards here during the day, indicating someone was inside. She picked up a stone and tossed it towards the opposite shadows. Thwack! The sound startled the two black-clad guards, who rushed towards the source of the noise. Seizing the opportunity, Margaret Harrington, her face masked by her black clothing, quickly slipped through the stone door. Beyond lay a long tunnel leading underground, lit by torches at intervals. The tunnel was dark and silent, the flickering torches casting elongated shadows on the walls, creating an eerie atmosphere. Margaret Harrington carefully made her way along the tunnel, soon encountering a large black iron door. Muffled groans emanated from within, a voice she recognized. Edward Harrington. Hurry, the purple fragrance pill is gone. Get more. A man's urgent command came from within, followed by the sound of someone running towards them. The man's voice was familiar, she'd heard it somewhere before. Margaret Harrington quickly positioned herself beside the iron door, pretending to be a guard. The iron door swung open, and a masked figure in black rushed out, paying her no mind as he hurried away. Margaret Harrington desperately wanted to see what was happening inside but dared not act rashly. She stood outside the iron door, listening to the increasingly agonizing groans within. What was going on? What had happened to Edward Harrington? Why was he in such pain? Soon, the black-clad figure returned with a medicine bottle. An idea struck Margaret Harrington. As the figure pushed open the door, she delivered a swift blow to his neck. Empowered by her newfound inner strength, her strike was far more powerful than before. The figure collapsed without a sound. Margaret Harrington dragged him aside, took the medicine bottle, and entered through the iron door. A wave of cold air washed over her as she stepped inside. Before her lay a vast, empty space, with a large iron cage in the center. Several smaller doors lined the far wall, their contents unknown. To Margaret Harrington's astonishment, a man lay curled up inside the large iron cage, trembling and groaning. His clothes were disheveled, and he was clearly in agony. That man was Edward Harrington, the current emperor's half-brother. Two men stood outside the cage, one was Edward Harrington's close guard, Henry Fletcher, and the other was the divine physician, Dr. Mason, whom she had met once before. Both watched the tormented figure in the cage with concern. Hearing Margaret Harrington enter, Dr. Mason immediately extended his hand. The medicine. Margaret Harrington quickly handed him the bottle. He took it and addressed Edward Harrington, "Your Highness, your purple fragrance pill." The curled-up figure struggled to lift his head, speaking weakly, "It's no use, it's useless anyway." His voice lacked its usual authority and nobility, replaced by exhaustion and despair. Margaret Harrington had never seen Edward Harrington like this, so helpless and hopeless, as if he might die at any moment. Why was he like this? Why was he locked in a cage? Your Highness. Henry Fletcher cried out, his voice choked with emotion. We will find an antidote, we will cure you. You must hold on. Cough, cough, it's just a legend, Edward Harrington said wearily. As soon as he finished speaking, he was seized by a violent coughing fit, spitting up blood. The crimson stain marked his lips and his expensive, yet disheveled, robes. Standing behind Henry Fletcher and Dr. Mason, Margaret Harrington trembled. Severed soul. It sounded like the name of a poison. Your Highness, it won't be, Henry Fletcher said, his voice filled with anguish. As long as we find the ice jade toad, we can cure the poison. You must hold on. Cough, cough, that's just a legend, Edward Harrington said weakly. Suddenly, another agonizing pain struck, like thousands upon thousands of swords piercing his flesh, stabbing his heart. Even a hardened man like Edward Harrington couldn't bear this endless torment. He curled up, howling like a wild beast. Crawling to the cage, he snatched the medicine bottle from Dr. Mason, ripped off the cap, and poured the contents down his throat, finally calming down. Margaret Harrington watched in horror from outside. Edward Harrington, a seasoned warrior, tough as steel, what kind of pain could torment him to such a wretched state? Seeing his pathetic state, an intense pain surged within her for some reason. The two Hong-Hon's effect on me is weakening, I can't endure it much longer, Edward Harrington groaned, lying flat on the ground, his voice weary yet calm. No, Your Highness, we will find the ice jade toad. You must persevere, don't give up. Dr. Mason urged. Yes, Your Highness, your subordinate will definitely find it. Henry Fletcher declared, his fists clenched, his gaze resolute. As you wish, Edward Harrington chuckled bitterly, his body starting to tremble again. The pain was returning. Soon, he was clutching himself, moaning in agony. Suddenly, he rose like a madman, screaming, and lunged headfirst into the cage. Bang! His head hit the bars, blood trickling from his hair. Margaret Harrington watched, horrified and heartbroken, but remained silent. If she revealed her identity, she would surely die tonight. Henry Fletcher abruptly turned and walked towards a small door. Deeper within, without a word. No. Henry Fletcher. Edward Harrington croaked, his voice hoarse. I don't need a woman. Henry Fletcher froze, turning back. But only bloodletting can ease Your Highness's pain. I don't need it. Edward Harrington roared through gritted teeth, his eyes, obscured by his hair, fixed on him. But then he clutched his head and moaned again. Your Highness, this is the only way, Dr. Mason said painfully. You cannot perish, the Windcloud Empire needs you, His Majesty needs you. Henry Fletcher reached a small door, opened it, dragged out a trembling woman, and threw her into the cage, locking it. He intended to. Just as Margaret Harrington suspected, Edward Harrington stared at the woman thrown in, like a starving beast finding its prey, a dangerous glint in his eyes. He had lost all reason. The woman, terrified by Edward Harrington, collapsed at the cage door, unable to stand, her lips trembling as she stammered, Your Highness. Edward Harrington stared at her, then suddenly lunged, pulling her towards him. Did he endure this every full moon? No wonder he was so cold, so guarded, his gaze unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, all sound ceased. Margaret Harrington turned to see Edward Harrington lying in the cage, clothes disheveled, unconscious. The woman, covered in blood, was dead. Margaret Harrington looked at the scene, a mix of emotions churning within her. Did women in the royal palace disappear like this, one after another? Go out and call someone to dispose of the body, Henry Fletcher ordered coldly. Margaret Harrington nodded quickly and rushed out through the iron gate. The unconscious black-clad man hadn't awakened yet, she was lucky. She quickly ran out of the secret passage and ordered the two guards at the stone door, go inside and dispose of the body, I'll guard this place." The two guards exchanged glances and went inside. Once they were out of sight, Margaret Harrington hurried away. As soon as they reached the large iron gate, they would discover the unconscious black-clad man, and her identity would be exposed. She had to leave quickly. Sneaking back to Falling Lotus Pavilion, she removed her nightclothes, hid them in a secret place in the wardrobe, climbed into bed, and pretended to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was filled with the scenes from the underground chamber. Edward Harrington in pain, Edward Harrington in madness, Edward Harrington ruthless, Edward Harrington helpless. Her foster father had said that the royal palace was heavily guarded, as if protecting a secret. So, this was his secret. A terrifying secret. No wonder Edward Harrington kept it hidden. If it were revealed, what a storm it would create. He would be seen as a monster. Though horrified by what she had witnessed, Margaret Harrington felt more worried and heartbroken for Edward Harrington. He had been enduring such horrors, and she had been completely unaware. She was heartbroken. #### Chapter 48, Good Brothers. Within the long, gloomy tunnel, two masked figures in black approached a large iron gate, only to find another black-clad figure lying prone on the ground. Startled, they called out to him several times, but received no response. "Quick, get out of here," one of them exclaimed, suddenly alert, and immediately ran towards the exit. The other pushed open the iron gate and urgently shouted, "Captain of the guard, there's been an intruder." Henry Fletcher, who was tending to Edward Harrington inside the iron cage, jumped and roared, "What?" Running out of the iron gate and seeing the unconscious figure on the ground, he immediately understood. He blamed himself for being so worried about the prince that he had neglected his surroundings. He bellowed, "All phantom wraiths, mobilize. Search the entire prince's mansion. Don't let that intruder escape alive." "Your order," the black-clad figure acknowledged and hurriedly ran off. Henry Fletcher looked at Edward Harrington with a complicated expression, muttering, "If this gets out, you know what will happen. Then, His Highness would surely be seen as a monster, scorned by the world." Dr. Mason's expression subtly shifted. He seemingly unintentionally glanced at the black-clad figure behind him. The figure and their gaze seemed somewhat familiar, as if he had seen them somewhere before. Who could it be? Lying in her bed, Margaret Harrington's keen hearing allowed her to pick up the sounds of the search outside. They must be turning every nook and cranny upside down looking for her right now. Margaret Harrington couldn't sleep all night. The searching black-clad figures had entered the Falling Summer Pavilion, but they hadn't disturbed her or entered her room. After all, she was Edward Harrington's woman, so they wouldn't dare to be reckless. Moreover, the person who was always secretly watching her outside hadn't seen her leave, which conveniently served as an alibi. As a top-tier assassin, it was actually quite easy for her to avoid their surveillance. No one would suspect her. The reason she couldn't sleep was Edward Harrington. All night, her mind was filled with his image. The next morning, she gave Lillian Moore a piece of paper and asked her to have Shui Zhen deliver it to the innkeeper of the Forest Breeze Inn in the city. The Forest Breeze Inn was a secret contact point for the Shadow Gang. Her foster father had told her that if anything happened, she could contact him through the innkeeper. Last night's events had deeply moved her, and there were still many things she didn't understand. She hoped to receive her foster father's help. Proud soaring palace, have you found the person? Edward Harrington, seated in the main seat, his face pale, asked slowly, his voice soft yet carrying a cold authority. Reporting to your highness, we haven't found them, Henry Fletcher replied, kneeling on one knee in the hall, ashamed. Have you discovered anything? He continued to ask. Besides some footprints around the artificial rockery, we haven't found anything else. Even Henry Fletcher himself felt ashamed to give such a report. This was the first time he had been played so thoroughly. Someone had taken advantage of a gap in their security without him realizing it, and he couldn't find a single clue. However, the guards around the mansion said that no one left last night, which proves that the intruder is still inside. We've searched the entire mansion and haven't found them, so it's highly likely that the person is someone within the mansion. You may leave and continue the investigation. Edward Harrington wearily dismissed him with a wave of his hand, rubbing his temples. As you command, Henry Fletcher acknowledged, bowing before withdrawing. Your Highness, you haven't fully recovered yet. You need more rest, Dr. Mason, who had been sitting quietly beside him, advised. Who do you think it could be? Edward Harrington inquired. This person is incredibly skilled. They infiltrated without a trace. But I glimpsed them once, and they seemed familiar, like I'd seen them somewhere before, Dr. Mason mused. Perhaps Henry Fletcher is right, and it's someone within the manor. Everyone in the manor is trustworthy, how could it be? Edward Harrington began, frowning, but Dr. Mason interrupted him. Don't forget the women in the manor, Your Highness. Are they all trustworthy? A woman? You think it's a woman? Edward Harrington asked, surprised. Yes. Judging by the figure, it's highly likely. Edward Harrington remained silent for a long moment before speaking. Who do you think sent them? Was it her? Does she truly want me dead? His voice was hoarse and filled with sorrow, leaving Dr. Mason momentarily speechless. Finally, he offered words of comfort. How, don't overthink it. Perhaps it wasn't her. Not her. Who else would relentlessly hound him like this, if not her? He truly couldn't understand why she harbored such intense hatred towards him. As long as the poison remains in my system, my secret will eventually be revealed, he said, his voice tinged with despair. How, don't give up. We'll find the antidote. Hasn't His Majesty received news about the ice jade toad? We'll find it. Besides, with so many shadows lurking in the manor, even if we don't find the culprit, we won't let them leak any information, Dr. Mason encouraged him resolutely. Thank you, Edward Harrington expressed his sincere gratitude to his friend. Without people like them who genuinely cared for him, he didn't know how many times he would have already perished. We're brothers. Dr. Mason declared, looking at him earnestly. Yes, brothers. You, my brother, Henry Fletcher, you're all my good brothers. Margaret Harrington had been restless for days, anxiously awaiting news from her adoptive father. She felt uneasy, and every time she closed her eyes, the images of that day flooded her mind. Soul severance, the name alone spoke of its cruel and merciless nature. She was deeply curious about who had poisoned him and who possessed such audacity to target the illustrious prince of the Windcloud Empire. Recalling the scene from that day, she couldn't help but feel heartache for the man. Who would have guessed that beneath the prince's radiant facade lay a weary and tormented heart, and behind his outward splendor hid endless suffering? In truth, they were the same kind of people. Both were pitiful souls wearing masks, living in the shadows, using unusual behavior to conceal their deeply wounded hearts. They were like porcupines, hurting others while simultaneously hurting themselves. Thinking this way, she felt a strange connection to him, a shared sense of being adrift in the world. She had almost forgotten the pain he had caused her. Now, she desperately wanted to know everything about him, about his life experiences, and about the soul severance poison within him. For days, as Lillian Moore had said, the royal mansion had increased its guard, with stricter entry and exit checks. She'd felt it. Several nights, she tried to sneak out of Falling Lotus Pavilion to investigate the underground palace, but failed. The watchful eyes in the shadows of Falling Lotus Pavilion had multiplied, making her too wary to act rashly. She also worried about her foster father's inability to send her news. She couldn't bother Glenn Watterson anymore. Every day, she diligently practiced her zither and martial arts, never slacking. No matter where, having the ability to protect oneself was the prerequisite for doing anything else. 10 days passed, and Margaret Harrington grew anxious, unsure of her foster father's situation. Today, after her midday meal, she sat by the window, chin in hand, lost in thought, when she suddenly felt a strong gust of wind sweep past. Startled, she looked around and saw Victor Blackwell, dressed in light blue robes, standing in the room, smiling at her. She quickly shut and bolted the window before hurrying to his side and asking in a low voice, "Foster father, why did you come during the day? It's very dangerous." "It's all right," he dismissed with a smile. They sat down at the table, and Margaret Harrington said, "The royal mansion has increased its bright and dark guards these past few days. I'm truly worried something unexpected might happen to you. The mansion's security is indeed much tighter. It took considerable effort for me to get in." "What's going on? Does it have anything to do with what you're investigating?" Victor Blackwell asked, frowning. "Yes," Margaret Harrington nodded slightly. "Foster father, have you found anything?" "Soul severance. It's an insidious poison originating from the western regions. It's said that those poisoned by it go mad every full moon, enduring the agony of 1,000 insects gnawing at their hearts. Because of this unbearable torment, most victims end their own lives. Due to its extreme cruelty, it's despised in the martial world and has vanished for decades." "Why do you ask? Has someone been poisoned?" Victor Blackwell's face was grave. "Yes," Margaret Harrington replied, her brow furrowed. "Is there an antidote?" "There's no cure." "How can that be?" Margaret Harrington murmured, her body going limp as she collapsed onto the chair. Though she'd braced herself for this answer, she still found it difficult to accept. 1,000 insects gnawing at one's heart, what unimaginable suffering. She couldn't bear to think how he endured every full moon. "Margaret, who's been poisoned? Is it Edward Harrington?" Victor Blackwell guessed, frowning at his distraught foster daughter. Margaret Harrington didn't answer his question, instead asking, "Foster father, since when have women been disappearing without a trace from Harrington Manor?" Victor Blackwell, unsure of her intent, answered honestly, "It seems to have started around the time Edward Harrington left the Imperial Palace and moved into the royal mansion. So, about 5 or 6 years ago." 5 or 6 years. Edward Harrington was 22 this year, meaning he'd been poisoned since he was 15 or 16. Heavens, he was just a child then. Who could be so cruel? Margaret Harrington couldn't help but ache for him. How much suffering had this man endured? "Godfather, who is Edward Harrington's greatest enemy?" Margaret Harrington composed herself and spoke again. Although she didn't explicitly say it, the astute Victor Blackwell guessed that Edward Harrington had been poisoned, and he was inwardly astonished. "Edward Harrington is the prince of the Windcloud Empire and commands a powerful army. He's also ruthless, so there are many who want him dead. Both within the empire and without. It's hard to say who his greatest enemy is," he finally said. Hearing this, Margaret Harrington didn't press further, but said, "Godfather, is there truly no way to counteract this poison? What about the ice jade toad?" "The ice jade toad might be a possibility, but it's incredibly difficult to obtain," Victor Blackwell said, frowning. "What do you mean?" "Legend has it that the ice jade toad is an ancient divine artifact, its entire body as translucent as crystal, capable of absorbing all poisons. It was once the treasured artifact of the Zheng family, a prominent martial arts clan. But 30 years ago, it was stolen by a man named Henry Fletcher, a master of martial arts. The Zheng family fought desperately to protect the artifact, but were nearly annihilated. Afterward, the man disappeared without a trace, along with the ice jade toad. Godfather, do you know the whereabouts of this man?" Margaret Harrington asked. After all, the Shadow Gang was the largest intelligence organization in the martial world. It was impossible that they hadn't searched for this man. Yes. Victor Blackwell nodded, as expected. Over the years, many people and organizations have inquired about him, and the Shadow Gang is no exception. But even if one knows his hiding place, no one can reach it. Why? Because he lives deep within the mountains and forests, surrounded by layers of protective barriers that no one can penetrate. My martial arts skills are virtually unmatched in the martial world, yet even I cannot overcome those barriers. It's alright, as long as there's hope, that's good. Margaret Harrington wasn't afraid, on the contrary, she felt a surge of joy. Finally, there was a way to help him alleviate his suffering. No matter how difficult it was, she wanted to try. Margaret, what are you planning to do? Do you intend to steal the ice jade toad? Victor Blackwell looked at her in astonishment and asked. Yes, I must obtain it. Margaret Harrington smiled faintly. You're mad. Victor Blackwell exclaimed. Do you realize what you're saying? You want to steal the ice jade toad? Even seasoned martial artists can barely overcome those barriers, let alone you, a delicate woman with no martial arts skills. Moreover, why are you so determined to find a cure for Edward Harrington? Is he truly worth this much devotion? Godfather, please don't be angry. Margaret Harrington quickly soothed him. Please, hear me out. All right, go on, Victor Blackwell said, trying to control his emotions. Why are you doing this? Is a heartless man like him worth your love? Godfather, I don't love him. Margaret Harrington stammered, her conscience pricked. She didn't understand why she wanted to find a cure for him, but she simply did, she didn't want him to suffer any longer. Suddenly, a thought struck her, providing a perfect excuse. He once saved my life, and I promised to repay him. I always keep my word. If I find the ice jade toad for him, then our debt will be considered settled. Foolish child. Victor Blackwell stared at her for a long moment, finally shaking his head and sighing. Even if you truly wish to repay him, do you believe with your current strength you can seize the ice jade toad? Even if you trained for another 20 years, you'd scarcely survive long enough to reach that man. Don't underestimate me, Godfather. Margaret Harrington smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on him with unwavering determination. Your goddaughter isn't as weak as you think. Just you wait and see. Chapter 49, Xiao Jian's suspicions. With the Lunar New Year approaching, feasts had been held in the palace for days, and as a prince, Edward Harrington naturally had to attend. Margaret Harrington stepped out of the Falling Lotus Pavilion and sat in the Garden Pavilion. From there, she could see the only road leading in and out of the prince's residence, and naturally, she could also see the owner of the residence, Edward Harrington. Tomorrow was New Year's Eve, and the prince's residence would certainly be bustling. She had decided to leave tomorrow for her foster father's shadow gang. There, she would learn martial arts and all the survival skills of ancient times. If fortunate, when she met Edward Harrington again, she could gift him the ice jade toad. But if unfortunate, she might never see him again. Therefore, before leaving, she wanted to see him one last time. Miss, it's getting late, let's go back. As dusk fell, Lillian Moore urged. No, you go back first, I want to stay here a little longer. Margaret Harrington, wrapped in a thick cotton coat, leaned against the pavilion pillar, her eyes half closed. Miss, are you waiting for the prince? After hesitating for a long time, Lillian Moore couldn't help but ask. Seeing that the miss didn't speak, she persuaded, there have been feasts in the palace these days, the prince won't be back until very late. Miss, you should go back first, it's not too late to see him tomorrow. Besides, you haven't had dinner yet. Lillian Moore, I'm not hungry, you go back first, I want to stay a little longer, when I've had enough, I'll go back myself, don't worry, and don't wait for me. Margaret Harrington opened her eyes and looked at her, instructing. All right then. Miss, you must come back early. Lillian Moore finally nodded and left. She had to leave this place tomorrow, and she felt a little reluctant. After all, she had lived in the prince's residence for half a year and had come to regard it as her home. Leaving this place truly filled her with reluctance. Once again, she looked around at the garden scenery and the densely packed magnificent palaces not far away, etching them deep into her mind. "Edward Harrington, I want to see you one more time, why haven't you appeared yet?" Watching the sunset gradually fall, the daylight gradually swallowed by darkness, she thought anxiously. It wasn't until the third watch that his figure appeared on that inevitable road. Margaret Harrington stood from afar, watching him and a man in white clothes supporting each other as they approached. Ahead, Steward Fu was holding a lantern to light their way, and under the dim light, she could see his footsteps were a bit unsteady. He must have drunk a lot of wine. She watched from afar, her heart filled with both joy and compassion. This man was truly extraordinary, her husband. Whether she had the chance to see him again in the future or not, she would remember him. After all, he was the man who had given her refuge in this world. Watching him gradually walk away, about to turn the corner, her heart suddenly ached, as if he would just quietly disappear from her life. Suddenly feeling very uncomfortable, she was about to look away when she saw Edward Harrington suddenly turn around and look straight in this direction. Their eyes locked across the night. Margaret Harrington felt her heart beat faster, an indescribable emotion welling up within her. She felt that he had seen her. "Is that you?" Running all the way to the pavilion, Edward Harrington asked cautiously. His voice was soft and careful, as if afraid that a loud voice would disturb the fairy in his heart. Margaret Harrington stood up. Through the night she could only see his bright eyes full of expectation, like the stars in the sky, so bright, so beautiful. His cautious voice mixed with expectation and sadness suddenly brought a layer of mist to her eyes. When did this usually arrogant, cold-blooded, bloodthirsty man become as helpless as a child? "It's me," she heard her own gentle voice reply. Edward Harrington, standing in front of the pavilion, seemed very moved. He strode forward and embraced her, holding her tightly, murmuring incessantly, "It's you. It's you. It really is you." Margaret Harrington was suddenly overwhelmed with 100 mixed emotions. At this moment, she knew that he truly had her in his heart. She also reached out and embraced his strong waist. "Your Highness." After an unknown amount of time, Margaret Harrington was awakened by a call. Looking up, she saw Steward Fu standing in the pavilion with a lantern. Beside him was a tall man in white. And that call was made by this man. Margaret Harrington was very familiar with this man. It was Xiao Jian, the one Edward Harrington called the Divine Physician. That night in the dungeon, he was beside Edward Harrington. Edward Harrington was also awakened by this call. He hurriedly released Margaret Harrington, pulled her in front of the man in white and said with some excitement, "Xiao Jian, this is Amidst, my princess. You haven't met her, have you?" Then he said to Margaret Harrington, "Amidst, his name is Xiao Jian, he's my good brother. He's the famous Divine Physician. Come on, greet him." "Greetings, brother." Under Edward Harrington's expectant gaze, Margaret Harrington had to nod and greet the man in white. She really wanted to tell Edward Harrington that he had actually introduced Xiao Jian to her before. But looking at his excited appearance, she said nothing. He was drunk tonight, forgetting that she was actually no longer his princess, a title he had bestowed upon her. "Princess, greetings, Your Highness." Xiao Jian also politely replied, "His Highness drank a lot of wine tonight, I hope Your Highness will take care of him." He knew that the woman in front of him was the one Edward Harrington loved the most, so he said that. "I will." Margaret Harrington looked at Edward Harrington and said. "Then Xiao Jian will take his leave." Xiao Jian glanced at the tall and slender princess, bowed slightly, and then turned to leave. Your Highness, this old servant will also take his leave." Steward Fu also tactfully excused himself, but carefully placed the lantern on the side of the pavilion. Seeing the two leave, Edward Harrington embraced Margaret Harrington again, softly calling, "I miss you so much." Xiao Jian walked away, couldn't help but look back. He saw that slender woman being held in Edward Harrington's arms. Under the dim lantern light, he always felt that this figure was very familiar. He didn't know where he had seen her before. Where was it? Margaret Harrington felt a mixture of amusement and exasperation. Edward Harrington held her tightly, whispering words of longing in her ear, and finally just fell asleep leaning against her. She wanted to wake him up, but seeing him sleeping soundly, she couldn't bear to do so. Wanting to help him back to his room, she discovered that his arm was tightly wrapped around her waist, making her unable to move. In the end, she had to pull him down to sit with her on the long bench beside the pavilion, letting him treat her like a large bolster. His head rested on her shoulder, his soft black hair intertwined with hers, his steady, hot breath brushing against her ear, bringing a tingling sensation. Her eyes, accustomed to the darkness, could clearly see his handsome features, his slightly parted lips emitting soft snores. During the day, he was very domineering, very cold, like a 1,000-year-old iceberg that never melted, but his sleeping posture was very peaceful, like a child. Leaning against each other like this, a very peaceful feeling of happiness rose in her heart. She truly hoped that time would stop at this moment, forever unchanging. Mor. He murmured in his dream, his tone both affectionate and pained. Slightly stunned, Margaret Harrington leaned her ear closer, wanting to hear his murmurs clearly. Why, he muttered, making Margaret Harrington feel puzzled, but his next words were like a knife cutting through her, almost bringing tears to her eyes. He said, "Why don't you want our child? I really want, to have a child that belongs to both of us." Why? At this moment, Margaret Harrington suddenly felt that what she had done before was a mistake. He was a pitiful man, only 22 years old, if in modern times, he would only be a young man. Living in the palace full of conspiracies and schemes since childhood, how much hardship he must have endured, the torment of the soul-severing pain, how painful it must have been, but he never spoke of it, only silently endured. He longed for love, longed for warmth, longed for a child of his own blood. But she was truly cruel, extinguishing his hope without a word. How could he not be angry, not heartbroken? She must have hurt him deeply. Stroking his handsome face, gently tracing his features, Margaret Harrington felt pity, remorse, and above all, reluctance. Parting today, who knows if they will ever meet again in this lifetime. But as long as she still breathes, she will find the antidote to the soul's severance poison for him. No matter how difficult, she will not give up. It's just that she doesn't know if, when everything has calmed down, they will have a chance to rekindle their past love. Even though she loves him, she cannot accept his multiple wives and concubines. If she cannot be his only one, she would rather have nothing at all. Well, she'll think about the future later. The urgent matter now is how to leave the royal mansion safely. She doesn't want her departure to cause him any more pain. Dawn had just broken when Edward Harrington awoke. He shivered, wondering why it was so cold. Opening his eyes, he looked around, surprised to find himself in the garden, a thick layer of frost covering the evergreen trees. As he moved, he felt a warm body beside him. Turning his head, he saw Margaret Harrington's sleeping face. He froze, stiffening, not daring to move. Why was she here? Why was she with him in the garden like this? What was going on? His mind raced, finally recalling last night at the palace, drowning his sorrows in wine, returning completely drunk. He met Margaret Harrington in the pavilion here, then, he embraced her, and after that, he remembered nothing. Did they just sit there, holding each other all night? She didn't push him away. The thought filled him with joy. He greedily gazed at her elegant, ethereal face, breathtakingly beautiful even without makeup, captivating him completely. Sometimes he even wondered if she had cast a spell on him, making him so infatuated with her. However, he was addicted to this feeling, just seeing her filled his heart. Listening to her playing the dan, the worries in his heart would disappear. What a magical feeling. But was she still angry with him? For his crazy actions that day? Feeling a little uneasy, he saw her eyelashes flutter. Startled, he instinctively masked all the emotions on his face. A moment later, Margaret Harrington opened her eyes. She looked around in a daze, then suddenly remembered everything from last night. Looking up at the man beside her, leaning against her, she saw Edward Harrington sitting motionless, his face expressionless, his gaze fixed on the distance. She smiled bitterly. Even now, he still didn't want to face her. She silently stood up, adjusted her clothes, and prepared to leave. "Are you just going to leave like that?" Edward Harrington's suppressed, angry voice rang out behind her, stopping her in her tracks. Margaret Harrington turned around, looking at him with some confusion. Edward Harrington stood up, looked at her, opened his mouth several times, but said nothing. His masculine pride prevented him from apologizing or expressing concern for her. He grew irritated under Margaret Harrington's questioning gaze, finally speaking with a hint of aggression. "Today is New Year's Eve, there's a banquet at the mansion tonight. Don't forget to attend." He then turned and walked away, almost as if fleeing. Margaret Harrington stood there, stunned, finally understanding his meaning, and couldn't help but find it amusing. This man had such a strange way of speaking. "Wait!" Margaret Harrington called after him. Edward Harrington stopped, turned around, and asked, "What?" "Nothing," Margaret Harrington smiled softly. "Just wanted to tell you not to drink too much, it's bad for your health. And it's cold, wear more clothes, don't catch a cold." Looking at her gentle smile, hearing her caring words, Edward Harrington stood frozen, only reacting after a moment. He then smiled and said, "I'll remember. I'll be back early tonight." Margaret Harrington nodded. They looked at each other and smiled, as if there had never been any unpleasantness between them, like a pair of lovers deeply in love, their affection overflowing. #### Chapter 50, Leaving the royal mansion. Edward Harrington turned and left, a radiant smile on his face, a stark contrast to his usual impassiveness, his heart filled with an unprecedented lightness and joy. Margaret had smiled at him. How wonderful, truly wonderful. He absolutely must return early tonight and celebrate the new year with her. He was truly looking forward to tonight. Watching him leave, the smile on Margaret Harrington's face gradually faded, turning bitter. She couldn't wait for him tonight. She was leaving. Would this man, so eager for her care and love, be heartbroken, be disappointed? At this moment, she truly didn't want to leave. But for the ice jade toad, for his future health, she couldn't hesitate. If he truly loved her, then he should wait patiently. A sharp sword is honed by grinding, the fragrance of plum blossoms is intensified by the cold. How can love last without weathering storms? How can one cherish time together without experiencing the pain of separation? If they were truly meant to be, they would certainly become husband and wife. After finishing lunch, Margaret Harrington dismissed Lillian Moore, placed a handwritten letter on the desk, then carried the soul-chasing lute and slowly walked out of the Falling Lotus Pavilion. In reality, the Falling Lotus Pavilion was a rather secluded courtyard within the royal mansion. Initially, because Edward Harrington disliked her, the second Miss Harrington, born a concubine's daughter, he had arranged for her to stay in the Falling Lotus Pavilion, far from his chambers. Later, as he began to value her, the Falling Lotus Pavilion became prosperous. The Falling Lotus Pavilion was located on the outer edge of the royal mansion, only a short distance and a wall away from the outside. Because it was daytime, and Margaret Harrington was only carrying the lute she usually used for practice, everyone assumed she was looking for a quiet place to practice, so no one suspected her. It wasn't until she reached the wall and nimbly leaped over it that the shadow guards watching in the darkness were stunned, realizing something was amiss. Thus, the bright guards and shadow guards were mobilized, pursuing Margaret Harrington. Once outside the royal mansion, Margaret Harrington slung the soul-chasing lute on her back and used her qigong to quickly flee. Within the royal mansion, fearing suspicion, she had never used her qigong, only memorized the mental techniques. But she was originally an assassin, so her qigong was highly proficient. In addition, she was quick-witted and resourceful, so the royal guards, whose martial arts were on par with Henry Fletcher, couldn't gain any advantage for a while. Xiao Jian hurriedly entered the royal mansion and upon entering, ran straight to the falling lotus pavilion. He was very worried, his forehead beaded with sweat. He finally remembered who that familiar back and slender figure belonged to. It was the masked figure in black he had encountered in the underground palace, and also the woman Edward loved most, Margaret Harrington. They say women are vipers, this woman had no good intentions, he must capture her. Knowing Edward wasn't here, and that it was highly improper for him to arrest someone within the royal mansion, he couldn't wait any longer. He had to quickly capture her, he couldn't let her harm his brother. Before reaching the falling lotus pavilion, he noticed something was amiss in the royal mansion. So he stopped his hurried steps, called a royal guard over, and asked, what happened in the mansion. The guard, knowing his close relationship with the prince, honestly replied, the princess consort from the falling lotus pavilion has escaped. What? Xiao Jian was startled, cold sweat pouring out, when did this happen? Just now. Someone has gone in pursuit, and someone has also been sent to inform the prince. Take me there. He shouted, grabbing the guard and running out of the mansion. Indeed, the royal guards were the most rigorously trained. Margaret Harrington was trapped in the woods outside the city, surrounded by guards, with almost no openings. Princess consort, please return to the mansion. The leader of the shadow guards spoke respectfully, but the firmness in his voice was evident. Margaret Harrington frowned slightly, not understanding why they still called her princess consort. In truth, she didn't know that although Edward Harrington had demoted her to concubine status, he still had the royal guards address her as princess consort, and the shadow guards stationed at the falling lotus pavilion were not there to monitor her, but to protect her. You're mistaken, I'm no longer the princess consort. Now I want to leave the royal mansion, you should all return. She stood calmly amidst the encirclement, speaking coldly. Princess consort, the prince has ordered that no one is allowed to leave the royal mansion. We ask you to comply, otherwise, we will have to offend, the leader of the shadow guards replied coldly. I want to leave, no one can stop me. She said coldly, her eyes fixed on him, so icy, exuding arrogance and dominance, not at all like a frail woman, but rather like a powerful warrior who had experienced countless battles. The leader of the shadow guards was inwardly alarmed, not daring to underestimate the seemingly frail woman before him, focusing all his attention on confronting her. He shouted softly, excuse me, and lunged towards Margaret Harrington, the other guards following suit. Margaret Harrington remained calm, darting left and right among them, her agility surprising the royal guards. They had never expected this beautiful, cold princess consort to be a martial arts expert. While fighting, Margaret Harrington secretly thought of a countermeasure. She had to quickly deal with them, otherwise, as time dragged on, she would definitely be at a disadvantage. Thinking of this, she kicked everyone away, quickly removing the soul-chasing lute from her back and holding it in her arms. She coldly addressed everyone, today, I'll let you witness the power of the soul-chasing lute. As she spoke, she placed one hand on the strings, and immediately a majestic and powerful melody filled with intense killing intent surged towards the royal guards. The sound of the lute was like invisible arrows, domineering and fierce. Everyone was terrified, hurriedly dodging the invisible arrows of the lute's sound. But this sound filled the sky and earth, how could it be easily avoided? In an instant, everyone felt a demonic sound pierce their ears, their heads aching as if struck by a hammer, their bodies numb, even their swords almost slipping from their grasp. Some directly clutched their heads and fell to the ground, others propped their swords on the ground, struggling to endure. Seeing them like this, Margaret Harrington was also astonished. She hadn't expected the soul-chasing lute to have such great power, that with just her current internal strength, she could defeat these royal guards whose martial arts were on par with Henry Fletcher. It seemed this lute was indeed a treasure, no wonder everyone wanted it. She stopped playing, holding the soul-chasing lute, standing among them, looking around at the staggering royal guards, and coldly said, go back and tell your prince, if I want to leave, no one can stop me." Having said that, she was about to turn and leave when suddenly a hurried call came from behind, "Wait." She turned to look and saw a white figure flying towards her like the wind, in the blink of an eye, standing before her. Following him was a royal guard. "Princess consort, you can't leave," Xiao Jian said in a tone that brooked no refusal. "Oh, and why is that?" Margaret Harrington looked at the white-clad man before her with some amusement. "I recognize you. You were the masked figure in black in the royal mansion's underground palace that day, weren't you?" Xiao Jian looked at her seriously. "It was me, so what?" Margaret Harrington said calmly. "It was you, then you can't leave the royal mansion." Xiao Jian's eyes revealed a murderous intent. He said coldly, "I won't allow anyone to harm the prince." "Harm?" Margaret Harrington sneered. "Edward Harrington calls you a divine physician, yet you can't cure his illness. What right do you have to stand before me and gesticulate?" "You!" Hit where it hurt, Xiao Jian was momentarily speechless with anger. "Don't be angry, I didn't mean to blame you." Margaret Harrington looked at him and said, "I just want to tell you, I won't harm Edward Harrington, I won't reveal a word about what happened that night in the royal mansion, you can rest assured. Since you don't have the ability to help Edward Harrington alleviate his suffering, then leave this matter to me." "You? What do you mean?" Xiao Jian asked, surprised, looking at her. "You don't need to know what I mean. You just need to understand that I won't harm Edward Harrington," Margaret Harrington said, turning to leave. The guard beside Xiao Jian stepped forward, wanting to stop her, but Xiao Jian pulled him back. "Let her go, we can't stop her," Xiao Jian said, watching her retreating figure with a complicated expression. The guard looked at his comrades lying scattered on the ground and bowed his head helplessly. "Let's all return to the manor." Xiao Jian sighed helplessly, addressing everyone. Just then, a furious roar mixed with anxiety suddenly rang out, "Where is she?" "Your Highness!" Everyone exclaimed, astonished to see Edward Harrington rushing towards them like a whirlwind. By this time, Margaret Harrington's figure had disappeared into the forest, nowhere to be found. Edward Harrington searched frantically throughout the forest, then sent people to scour the entire city, only returning to the manor in a daze late at night. Tonight was New Year's Eve, and there was a New Year's Eve banquet in the manor, but because the former princess had run away, and the prince was furious, the entire manor was quiet, devoid of any New Year's atmosphere. Edward Harrington arrived at the Falling Lotus Pavilion, entered Margaret Harrington's bedchamber, looked at the furnishings in the room, still the same, and felt a sharp pain, both angry and resentful. He still remembered her bright smile this morning, promising to wait for him to return to celebrate the new year together. He had thought they would reconcile as before, but it turned out she had tricked him. She had planned to escape all along. Why? Why? Why did she run away? "Bring me wine," he roared, and the guards outside immediately brought 2 jars of fine wine. "How, tonight is New Year's Eve, don't be like this." Xiao Jian and Henry Fletcher followed the guards into the room, and seeing Edward Harrington's distraught state, Xiao Jian held his hand, which was reaching for the wine, and tried to persuade him. "Leave me alone." Edward Harrington flung his hand away and roared. Xiao Jian stood beside him anxiously, not knowing how to comfort him. Henry Fletcher stood nearby, also with a worried expression. Edward Harrington tore off the lid of the wine jar and started guzzling it down. Xiao Jian tried to stop him several times, but knowing his deep distress, he said nothing more. "Your Highness, a letter from the princess." Henry Fletcher, with his sharp eyes, noticed a letter under the inkstone on the desk by the window and hurriedly took it to Edward Harrington. Edward Harrington was startled, quickly put down the wine jar, and took the letter from Henry Fletcher, opening it. As the familiar handwriting appeared before his eyes, Edward Harrington's heart pounded. Seeing his excited and joyful expression, Xiao Jian and Henry Fletcher tactfully withdrew and closed the door. Edward Harrington, by the time you see this letter, I will have already left the manor. I said, if I wanted to leave the manor, no one could stop me. You might not have believed it then, but you should believe it now. Edward Harrington's heart ached. When she said those words, he truly hadn't believed her. The manor, with its tight security, wasn't a place a delicate woman like her could easily enter or leave. He never expected that one day she would choose to leave. Now he deeply regretted not realizing her intention to escape. We are fundamentally not from the same world, so our views on life are naturally different. In my view, marriage is not a tool to bind people, and having children is not just for carrying on the family line. Children are the crystallization of love, and every child who comes into this world should be happy. But your love makes me feel insecure. I don't want to have children for such a love. The love I want is like choosing one scoop of water from the vast river, it's finding one heart and never parting until our hair turns white, it's absolute loyalty, both physically and spiritually. Clearly, you, a man with countless women, cannot do this. Reading up to this point, Edward Harrington's heart was filled with bitterness. So this was the reason she took contraceptive pills. Why didn't she tell him? For her, he was willing to give up everything, even absolute loyalty, both physically and spiritually, he could do it. How could she think he couldn't? Did she not trust him that much? Heartbroken, he continued reading. The person in black who infiltrated the dungeon that day was me. I accidentally saw your secret. Seeing this, Edward Harrington's eyes widened in astonishment, and he hurriedly read on. You must be very surprised. Don't underestimate me. I'm not a weak woman who can't fight. In my past life, I was an assassin. I entered assassin training camp at the age of 6. From then on, I lived a hellish life, killing people was a daily occurrence, so infiltrating the dungeon wasn't difficult for me. Seeing you in the dungeon surprised and saddened me. I hope you don't give up, no matter how much pain you have to endure, you must live well. Life is precious, don't give up easily. Don't worry, I won't reveal this. So she was once an assassin. Imagining her living the hellish life of an assassin since she was 6, he felt a sharp pain. So her cold eyes, her indifferent expression, were because of this. He had blamed her for being heartless, but he never knew what she had been through. He truly was a bastard. Hashtag Chapter 51, continuing the Shadow Gang's palm strike, I'm leaving. Everyone eventually has their own life, and it's time for me to seek a new beginning. I truly appreciate you taking care of me for the past 6 months, no matter what happens, I will remember you as a friend. I hope that the next time we meet, you will have recovered and be living a healthy life. A friend? Could it be that in her heart, I'm only a friend? No, I won't allow it. She is my princess, and will always be, I will definitely find her. Lillian Moore is a kind woman, like a sister to me, I hope you will treat her well for my sake. She and Shui Zhen, the son of Uncle Fook, are in love, I hope you will help them unite. I would be extremely grateful. Margaret Harrington. Sitting silently for a long time, staring at the letter, Edward Harrington called out, someone. Xiao Jian and Henry Fletcher immediately pushed the door open and entered. Henry Fletcher hastily asked, Your Highness, what are your orders? Announce throughout the country that the princess is missing, and offer a reward of 10,000 taels of gold to anyone who finds information about her. How, what do you want to do? Xiao Jian frowned, worried and confused. Xiao Jian, this time I will not let go. Edward Harrington looked at Xiao Jian, speaking firmly and seriously. Your Highness, it's late, I have simmered ginseng soup for you. Please have some to warm yourself. Suddenly, a sweet, feminine voice came from outside the door. It turned out to be Helena, taking advantage of her pregnancy to shamelessly try to win his favor. Edward Harrington's face immediately darkened. He remembered Margaret Harrington's words, children are the crystallization of love and absolute loyalty, both physically and mentally, and felt even more disgusted with the woman outside the door. "Get out," he roared. Edward Harrington's rage radiated outwards, palpable even through the closed door. Helena shuddered, saying, "I'll take my leave," and hurriedly ran away. She knew Edward Harrington's temper well and didn't dare to linger. Edward Harrington clenched his fists. This audacious slave girl, daring to seduce him while he was drunk and even cause trouble for the woman he loved, he would not spare her. Spring passed and autumn arrived, flowers bloomed and withered. For a whole year, Margaret Harrington diligently practiced martial arts at Shadow Gang. She was intelligent and hardworking, her martial arts progressing rapidly, her mastery of the soul-chasing darts becoming exceptional. Victor Blackwell always exclaimed that this young woman was a martial arts prodigy. After a year of effort, her skills had far surpassed his own. This year, Margaret Harrington lived a full and intense life, practicing martial arts every day, immersing herself in profound martial arts, making progress and gaining understanding bit by bit. Although tired, her soul was at peace. But she still hadn't forgotten the most important task, finding the ice jade toad for Edward Harrington. Over the past year, the entire Shadow Gang was mobilized to search for traces of the ice jade toad, while also keeping an eye on the movements of the royal palace. Thus, she knew that every month, women in the royal palace disappeared without a trace, and that Edward Harrington was still searching for news of her. She couldn't do anything but diligently practice and wait for news of the ice jade toad. Until last month, her adoptive father finally found information about the ice jade toad, and her martial arts had also reached a high level, so she prepared to set off to find the medicine in a few days. Today was New Year's Eve, and she celebrated the new year with her adoptive father at Shadow Gang. Because it was a holiday, Shadow Gang was also very lively. Everywhere was decorated with lanterns and flowers, a scene of jubilation. The branch leaders of Shadow Gang, scattered throughout the country, had all gathered today, raising their cups in celebration. In the spacious main hall, Victor Blackwell sat in the main seat on the high platform. Today, he wore a splendid blue robe, his face beaming with joy. In the seat to his lower left sat Margaret Harrington, dressed in blue. Margaret Harrington still disguised herself as a man, neat and strong. In Shadow Gang, she always dressed like this, and everyone knew she was a woman. Further below, on the left and right, sat a man and a woman. The man was handsome, the woman beautiful, but both had icy expressions, radiating a chilling aura. These two, whose martial arts were on par with Henry Fletcher, were the left and right guardians of the Palace Lord, holding the highest positions in Shadow Gang after Victor Blackwell. The man was called Ghost Hand, the woman Heartless. Below the high platform, the branch leaders were divided into two rows, seated according to their rank from the inside to the entrance of the hall. As soon as Margaret Harrington sat down next to Victor Blackwell, the sound of drums and music filled the hall, and groups of beautiful young women in splendid costumes ran into the hall, singing and dancing exuberantly, creating a truly lively atmosphere. Laughter and applause echoed throughout the hall. Margaret Harrington was also infected by this lively atmosphere, a relaxed smile appearing on the corner of her lips. She tilted her head and asked, "Adoptive father, is it this lively here every New Year?" Victor Blackwell smiled and said, "Not really. The branch leaders only gather every few years, usually when there's a major event in the martial arts world or a significant incident in the palace. So that's how it is." "Then what is the reason for this gathering?" Margaret Harrington asked curiously. "Don't worry, you'll find out later." Victor Blackwell looked at her and smiled. "Tonight's singing and dancing are very special, you must enjoy them thoroughly." "Yes, adoptive father," Margaret Harrington nodded. A piece of music ended, the drums and music fell silent, and the dancers retreated. Shadow Gang Palace Lord Victor Blackwell raised his cup and said, "Our Shadow Gang rarely gathers. Today, at this meeting, I would like to offer everyone a toast, thanking you all for your hard work over the years." "Thank you, Palace Lord. This is our duty," everyone raised their cups, nodded, and said, "Cheers." Victor Blackwell said heartily. "Cheers," everyone replied. Everyone in the hall raised their cups and drank them dry. "Actually, the reason I summoned everyone here this time is to announce something," Victor Blackwell began. "I have been the Palace Lord for over 20 years now, and I am getting old. Handling the affairs of the palace has become too much for me, so today I have called everyone here to tell you that I, Victor Blackwell, am abdicating today and passing on the position of Shadow Gang Palace Lord to my adopted daughter, Sophia Gale." There was a moment of silence in the hall, but soon it was filled with murmurs and whispers. Everyone was in disbelief. Victor Blackwell was only in his 50s, not old at all, so why would he want to relinquish his position? Margaret Harrington was also stunned, not understanding why her adoptive father had such an idea. Sophia Gale referred to her. Her alias in Shadow Gang was Sophia Gale, and she was the adopted daughter of Palace Lord Victor Blackwell. "Adoptive father, you?" she asked in astonishment. But Victor Blackwell stopped her. "Sophia Gale, don't refuse. You are the one I have chosen to be the next Palace Lord," Victor Blackwell looked at her and said seriously. "But I have no intention of becoming the Palace Lord." "I know, adoptive father. But you are the most suitable person, no one can handle this position better than you." After saying that, Victor Blackwell stood up and pulled Margaret Harrington up to face everyone. "Everyone, be quiet. This is my adopted daughter, Sophia Gale. She is exceptionally intelligent, her martial arts are on par with Henry Fletcher, her strategies are brilliant, and she is far more outstanding than me. With her leadership, our Shadow Gang will surely become famous in the martial arts world and grow even stronger. Now, I hand over the token of leadership to her. From now on, she is the master of Shadow Gang." With that, he took out a blue jade command arrow from his sleeve, its shaft carved with the image of a dragon and bearing the two words, Shadow Gang. He presented it to Margaret Harrington with both hands. "My good daughter, the future of Shadow Gang is in your hands," he said solemnly. In front of everyone, Margaret Harrington couldn't bear to disappoint her adoptive father, so she whispered, "Adoptive father, I'm about to go search for the ice jade toad, and my life is uncertain. Doing this is really not appropriate. I believe you will return safely. Don't hesitate any longer, quickly accept the command arrow," he urged in a low voice. After a moment of internal struggle, Margaret Harrington finally accepted the command arrow with both hands and turned to face everyone. "Why haven't you greeted the new Palace Lord yet?" Seeing that the people below remained standing, Victor Blackwell said with displeasure. The left and right guardians led the way, kneeling down and shouting in unison, "We greet the new Palace Lord." They had interacted with Margaret Harrington a lot and naturally knew the capabilities of the Palace Lord's adopted daughter, so they bowed in sincere admiration. The sub-Palace Lords below the high platform, seeing the highest-ranking Dharma protector in the palace also willing to submit to the new Palace Lord, dared not object and hastily knelt down, saying in unison, "We greet the new Palace Lord. Rise, all of you." Margaret Harrington declared authoritatively. "Sophia Gale is new to the Shadow Gang and her knowledge is limited, so I hope you will all support her. Although Sophia Gale is the Palace Lord, there's no need for tension. Just continue your work as usual. Rewards for merit, punishment for faults, Sophia Gale knows nothing else but to be fair and just. As long as everyone works together for the Shadow Gang, I will certainly not treat you unfairly." Hearing Margaret Harrington's words, both commanding and gracious, everyone hastily replied, "Rest assured, Palace Lord, we will dedicate ourselves to the Shadow Gang, even unto death." "Excellent. Please be seated, everyone. Bring out the fine wine, play the music, let the feast continue." While New Year's Eve was a scene of jubilation here, the royal palace in the capital city presented a different, desolate picture. Edward Harrington sat alone in Margaret Harrington's room in the Falling Lotus Pavilion, facing a table laden with food, his heart heavy with sorrow. A year has passed, Margaret, where have you gone?" he murmured. Only the cold air and the icy wind outside the window answered him. "Foster father, you're only in your 50s, still in your prime, why abdicate?" Margaret Harrington asked Victor Blackwell, puzzled. "Sigh," Victor Blackwell sighed. "After so many years in this world, I've grown weary. In my youth, I promised Rose I would travel with her, see the beautiful landscapes of our land. Sadly, this wish remains unfulfilled, and Rose is gone. Now that I've found a clue to Rose's whereabouts, and your martial arts no longer need my guidance, I have nothing left to desire. So I plan to wander the world, see the sights I never saw before, and fulfill my promise to Rose. If you no longer wish to be the Shadow Gang Palace Lord, I won't stop you. But why pass the position to me? You know I'm about to embark on a search for the Ice Jade Toad, a perilous journey with uncertain outcomes. Why pass the leadership to me at this time?" Margaret Harrington asked, perplexed. "Having lived with you for a year, I see you as a capable young woman, nothing seems to pose a challenge for you. So, in this quest for the medicine, I believe you will return safely. I also believe that the Shadow Gang, in your hands, will achieve great things." Victor Blackwell patted her shoulder. Margaret Harrington felt a warmth spread through her at her foster father's trust. Although she didn't desire the position of Palace Lord, she knew that once her foster father made a decision, it was difficult to change, so she didn't refuse further. "Foster father, if I decide to stop the Shadow Gang from accepting assassination missions, would you object?" she asked Victor Blackwell, her eyes shining. "You are the Shadow Gang Palace Lord now, all decisions are yours. You don't need to concern yourself with me," Victor Blackwell said with a smile. Margaret Harrington smiled back. "All right then, foster father, I accept this position. Foster father, in a month, I will set out to find the Ice Jade Toad. I hope that during my absence, you can stay at the Shadow Gang and help me manage the palace affairs. When I return, I will surely let you travel the world with peace of mind," Margaret Harrington said. "Of course," Victor Blackwell replied cheerfully. "You're still unfamiliar with the daily operations of the Shadow Gang, so I'll stay and assist you for a while. I'll only feel at ease once you've mastered everything." "Thank you, foster father." Victor Blackwell paused, then said thoughtfully, "Foster father is asking you again, are you truly determined to search for the Ice Jade Toad? Is that person worth such a risk?" Margaret Harrington was silent for a moment before speaking. "Foster father, my initial reason for leaving the manor was to find a cure for him, and my martial arts training was for the same purpose. Although a year has passed, my goal remains unchanged." "Margaret, do you love him?" Victor Blackwell asked. "I don't know. Perhaps I do, perhaps it's out of gratitude. I can't tell the difference," Margaret Harrington admitted with a wry smile. "Honestly, I truly don't want you to have feelings for him," Victor Blackwell sighed. "They say royalty is heartless. He's a prince, how much true affection can he have for you? Although he hasn't given up searching for you this past year, doesn't the woman in his manor change every few days? Such a man is truly not a good match for you. Risking your life for such a man is not worth it." "Foster father," Margaret Harrington said with a smile. "There's no worth it or not worth it. I only seek peace of mind. Seeing him tormented by illness like that, I truly can't bear it. Seeking peace of mind is good. I just fear you'll fall deeply in love without realizing it," Victor Blackwell said with a reproachful look. "Don't worry, foster father, I know my limits when it comes to matters of the heart," Margaret Harrington quickly reassured him. "Sigh, I can't control matters of the heart. I only hope you'll be happy, that's all that matters," Victor Blackwell said, somewhat resigned. "Let's not talk about this anymore. Let's discuss finding the Ice Jade Toad. I've learned that the man who stole the Ice Jade Toad is now living in seclusion on Kirin Mountain, 500 miles from the capital. It's heavily guarded. Let's discuss how to infiltrate it. Chapter 52, The first trial 1 month later, under the radiant sun, spring arrived with blooming flowers. Margaret Harrington rode towards Kirin Mountain, followed by her 2 guardians, Ghost Hand and Heartless. Reaching the entrance of Shadow Gang's territory, Margaret Harrington, still mounted, declared, "Godfather, this journey to Kirin Mountain is fraught with peril. If I haven't returned within a month, assume the worst. Don't wait for me any longer, choose a worthy successor for Shadow Gang. Then, please travel to Diddy Kingdom and tell Edward Harrington to give up on me, to let go of any hope." "Margaret, what nonsense are you spouting? A month, the worst happening." Victor Blackwell roared in disapproval. "You're the chosen successor of Shadow Gang, not so easily killed. You will return safely. I won't tolerate even a single hair missing." Yes, Godfather, I won't speak of such things again. I'll definitely return safely." Margaret Harrington quickly laughed it off. "Godfather, I'm off now. Take care." "Yes. Take good care of yourself out there." Victor Blackwell reluctantly advised, "Whether you find the ice jade toad or not, you must return alive." "Don't worry, Godfather, I will." With that, Margaret Harrington spurred her horse forward, Ghost Hand and Heartless close behind. The galloping horse left a thick cloud of dust in its wake. Kirin Mountain, with its towering trees, dense forests, and flocks of birds, was a perfectly preserved primeval forest, a rare sight in the crowded modern age. But Margaret Harrington knew that countless dangers lurked within. Guided by Ghost Hand and Heartless, she entered this desolate mountain. The path was treacherous and rugged, the vegetation dense and thorny, and strange animal roars and insect buzzes echoed around them. The dense canopy obscured the sky, creating an eerie, chilling atmosphere. Even Ghost Hand and Heartless paled, but Margaret Harrington remained calm and composed, earning her the Shadow Gang guardians' renewed respect. This composure was thanks to the harsh jungle training she had endured in the modern era. There was a time when her godfather had abandoned them on a deserted island, leaving them to fend for themselves. The island teemed with ferocious beasts, survival meant overcoming them. Many comrades perished in the jaws of these creatures, but she persevered. Having lived amongst such beasts, she could face any predator with equanimity. As dusk approached, they finally reached a ravine. The ravine was incredibly deep, its bottom obscured by swirling mist. The opposite cliff face was over 20 meters away. Even the most skilled in light body techniques couldn't leap across. It seemed this was the first trial her godfather had mentioned. To meet the man who had stolen the ice jade toad, she had to cross this ravine first. "Ghost Hand, Heartless, I've arrived. Return now. The forest is dangerous at night. You must leave Kirin Mountain before dark." Margaret Harrington turned and commanded her guardians. "Master, we wish to face this trial with you," they said in unison. "No need, I can handle this alone. Matters in the palace are piling up, you two should return quickly. Also, I've already assigned you the Shadow Gang development plan. While I'm away, follow the plan I've written. I'll check the results when I return." Margaret Harrington said in a tone that brooked no argument. "As you command." The two put down the items they had brought for the palace lord and left as ordered. After they left, Margaret Harrington stood at the edge of the precipice for a while, lost in thought, then retreated to find a flat, clean rock to sit down and rest. "I can't cross today. After traveling all day, I'm truly exhausted. I don't know the situation on the other side yet. I'll rest here for a night to recover my strength and cross the chasm tomorrow morning." Soon, the sky turned completely dark. The early spring night was still chilly, so Margaret Harrington started a fire and sat beside it to warm herself. She took out dried rations and a water pouch from her backpack, ate and drank sparingly, then leaned against the rock to rest. At midnight, the howls of wolves echoed from the forest. Margaret Harrington jolted awake, quickly found a large tree nearby, and swiftly climbed up. Sitting on a high branch, she saw a pack of dark shadows rushing towards her, their green eyes gleaming in the darkness. Margaret Harrington paid them no mind, lazily closing her eyes as she sat on the branch. The pack of wolves gathered around the base of the tree, anxiously pacing back and forth, howling mournful cries up at the tree. Margaret Harrington still seemed to hear nothing, keeping her eyes closed as she rested. A fierce battle awaited her tomorrow, and she needed to rest well. As for these beasts, they didn't know how to climb trees anyway. She would just ignore their noise and deal with them in the morning. The east gradually revealed the rising sun, and when the first ray of sunlight touched Margaret Harrington's face, she awoke. Looking down at the base of the tree, most of the wolves had dispersed, but a few stubborn ones remained, guarding the base, their eyes fixed on the tasty morsel in the tree. She withdrew her sharp gaze and took a hard bun from her pack, taking a few bites. Someone like her, always living on the edge of death, wasn't picky about food, as long as her stomach was full. The hungry wolves at the base of the tree heard the small sound, their tongues lolling out, their eyes flashing with bloodlust. A mocking smile played on her lips. Margaret Harrington took out several exquisitely crafted plum blossom darts from her pack. These were specially commissioned from her foster father, who had them forged for her. Small but sharp, they were deadly upon contact, a very effective hidden weapon. Since these wolves were looking for death, she would grant their wish and get some practice in at the same time. With a whoosh, the darts flew out simultaneously, hurtling towards the hungry wolves like lightning. In the blink of an eye, blood splattered everywhere. Looking again, the wolves had all fallen to the ground, their green eyes wide with disbelief. It seemed even wolves could be caught off guard. Avoiding the wolf's blood pool on the ground, she quickly reached the cliff's edge. She had to cross swiftly, otherwise, the thick, bloody stench would attract a pack of ravenous beasts. Then, she'd be in deep trouble. Before arriving, she had devised a plan to cross the chasm. Now she just needed a few tools. Not far away grew several tall bamboo stalks, which she had spotted while surveying the area yesterday. She unbuckled the treasured sword from her hip and swiftly cut a long bamboo pole. With a rope she'd prepared in her pack wrapped around her slender waist, and her pack and soul-seeking zither secured to her back, Margaret Harrington took the bamboo pole, stepped back, then sprinted towards the precipice. Planting the pole, she launched herself into the air, tracing a graceful arc across the sky towards the other side of the canyon. 5 or 6 meters from the opposite bank, Margaret Harrington plummeted, nearly falling into the bottomless abyss. But at that critical moment, a rope shot out from her falling form towards the far side. The grappling hook at the rope's end instantly snagged a protruding rock, halting her descent, leaving the petite woman suspended midair. Margaret Harrington took a deep breath, gripped the rope tightly, and ascended with the agility of a monkey, quickly reaching the top. Gasping for breath on the cliff top, Margaret Harrington didn't dare linger, immediately running forward. Ahead, a distinct narrow path led her to a flat, fragrant meadow, vast yet strangely unsettling. Why was there only grass and no trees? Amidst a dense, primeval forest, the sudden appearance of such a large meadow was truly bizarre. With suspicion in her heart, she took a few steps into the meadow, only to have the scenery abruptly shift, as if she'd instantly entered another world. Mist enveloped everything, dreamlike, obscuring all but a few large tree trunks. Margaret Harrington's heart skipped a beat. Had she stumbled into someone's 5 elements 8 trigrams formation? Hastily retreating a step, intending to find another way, she heard the whistling of arrows hurtling towards her. Margaret Harrington's sharp eyes reacted before her mind could process the threat. Leaping and twisting, she dodged the incoming arrows with simian agility. The arrow barrage finally ceased. Margaret Harrington stood alert, not daring to move recklessly. She knew that once trapped in a formation, escape was unlikely, she could only push forward. During her year with the Shadow Gang, she had studied various ancient formations. Judging by the misty scene before her, this was likely the rare bewildering mist formation. The forest hidden within the mist was probably arranged according to the Chimanduanja principles of the heavenly stems and 9 palaces 8 trigrams. This arrangement, with its endless variations, concealed countless dangers and had no known solution, requiring equal parts intellect and luck to navigate. In modern times, esoteric arts like Chimanduanja and the 5 elements 8 trigrams had long been lost. She'd always dismissed the strange formations depicted in historical accounts or television dramas as fabrications. Even after studying some texts on formations in this ancient era, she'd never witnessed one firsthand. Today, experiencing this bizarre scene, she realized they truly existed, possessing considerable power, a strange phenomenon indeed. These 5 elements 8 trigrams formations were riddled with mechanisms, a single touch altering everything. But there was a Sheng gate, finding it meant safe passage out. She couldn't wait passively for death, she had to take the initiative. Sword in hand, she advanced cautiously, every step taken with heightened awareness, ears attuned to all directions, eyes scanning her surroundings. A tiger's roar shattered the stillness, the scene transforming. Abruptly, 2 white-browed tigers materialized, snarling menacingly. Margaret Harrington, startled, swiftly channeled her energy, her whirling sword emitting a cold, radiating light. The tigers crouched, tails lashing, then lunged towards her head. She rolled, narrowly avoiding one, the beast landing behind her. Now, flanked by the tigers, their fangs bared and claws extended, Margaret Harrington glared back, quickly retrieving her soul-chasing zither from her back. Fingers dancing across the strings, she unleashed a melody charged with killing intent, the notes transforming into sharp arrows aimed at the 2 tigers. But the tigers remained unaffected by the music, roaring again as they charged. A cold sweat broke out on Margaret Harrington. In this critical moment, she channeled her energy, leaping onto the head of the foremost tiger and flipping over it, narrowly escaping their combined assault. Why were they impervious to the zither's power? She looked up in astonishment at the tigers, still snarling, poised to attack. Studying their eyes, she noted their intensity, yet devoid of the bloodlust and greed of wild beasts. Margaret Harrington shifted slightly, but their gaze remained fixed straight ahead. They were fake. Breathing a sigh of relief, she stood upright, realizing she was drenched in cold sweat. With a wry chuckle and a shake of her head, she stepped to the left. As expected, the tigers vanished, replaced by a misty forest. Before she could rejoice, after only a few steps, her footing gave way. She lost her balance, plummeting downwards, a large object casting a heavy shadow above her. Margaret Harrington's heart leaped into her throat. Below, she saw a pit filled with sharpened bamboo stakes. Falling into that would mean certain, gruesome death. In this desperate moment, clutching the soul-chasing zither in one hand, she drew her sword with the other, plunging it into the pit wall, her body pressing against it. Boom! A deafening crash reverberated through the air. Through the swirling dust, Margaret Harrington looked down into the pit, gasping in horror. A massive boulder had fallen, nearly filling the entire space, crushing the bamboo stakes. Had she fallen, even if she'd avoided impalement, she would have been crushed beneath its weight. Margaret Harrington clung to the jutting rocks, slowly crawling towards the pit's edge. A sharp, stinging pain shot through her shoulder with every movement, and she felt the stickiness of blood spreading across her back. She remembered then, the moment the boulder fell, it grazed her shoulder, nearly dragging her into the abyss. That's when she'd been injured. Gritting her teeth against the throbbing pain, she hauled herself up, the climb a grueling test of her strength. Chapter 53, Breaking the Precious Dragon. Entering the snake's lair. This intricate ancient formation was truly formidable. She swore, if she ever escaped, she would dedicate herself to mastering these damned ancient formations, and then, obliterate every single one from the face of the earth. The thick fog persisted, obscuring everything, driving Margaret Harrington to the brink of madness. These damned mists. Was she really going to die here? With the advanced knowledge of someone from thousands of years in the future, wouldn't dying in a place like this be utterly humiliating? No, she absolutely had to get out of here. This time, she was smarter. She used her treasured sword, or perhaps the plum blossom dart, to probe the path ahead, ensuring her safety before proceeding. It was a clumsy method, but effective. The sight of the dart traps, the pitfalls beneath her feet, the boulders plummeting from above, the venomous insects crawling on the walls, the poisonous plants at her feet, and the countless white bones filled Margaret Harrington with dread. Who had devised this cruel formation? It was clearly designed to leave no survivors. After enduring countless arrow showers, trap pits, and other perils, sustaining several more injuries along the way, Margaret Harrington, through sheer courage and a touch of luck, finally found the gate of life, and emerged from the deadly labyrinth. Standing outside the formation, Margaret Harrington breathed a sigh of relief. Behind her lay the same verdant meadow, with no trace of the dense fog and treacherous landscape she had just escaped. Before her rose a sheer cliff face, its peak lost in the heights. A stone table stood before the cliff, upon which rested a black and white go board. Scattered around were several skeletons, along with swords and other belongings, undoubtedly left behind by those who had perished. What was this? Was there no way forward? With the impassable cliff ahead and the death trap behind, what was she to do? Margaret Harrington carefully examined the cliff face, rapping on the stone, but found no hidden mechanisms. Yet, she was certain there must be a secret passage leading elsewhere. This couldn't possibly be a dead end. Her gaze fixed on the black and white go board on the stone table. This had to be the key to opening the secret passage. Sitting down calmly on the stone table, she scrutinized the board. The black and white stones were locked in a fierce standoff, neither side yielding, their forces evenly matched, with no apparent weakness to exploit. The next move was crucial, but even the slightest misstep could alter the entire game. Moving any piece could lead to mutual destruction. It was a rare precious dragon formation, seen only once in a century. The person who had devised this game was undoubtedly cunning and brilliant. No wonder so many had perished trying to overcome this obstacle. But Margaret Harrington was not among them. The greater the challenge, the more it ignited her interest. She was a Go prodigy, unmatched throughout the world. No, throughout the 21st century. Though the one who set this board was formidable, she wouldn't lose to someone from the past, especially not in Go, her forte. From a young age, she'd been captivated by Go, and her assassin's training demanded mastery of everything, including this ancient game. In the modern era, she'd devoted considerable effort to studying it. If not for her unique circumstances preventing her from competing, she would undoubtedly be the world Go champion. This trial played to her strengths, failure was not an option. Dismissing distractions, she sat and focused. A turbulent mind was a Go player's worst enemy, guaranteeing defeat before the first move. Racking her brain, her vision filled with a crisscross of black and white stones, where should she play? The next move was black, hers. This move would decide victory or defeat. Where to place the stone? The board seemed like an endgame scenario, any move potentially trapping her black stones in a deadlock. What to do? Margaret Harrington furrowed her brow, gaze fixed on the board, beads of sweat forming on her smooth forehead. Her travel-worn yet captivating face lost its usual cold detachment and feigned timidity, replaced by a striking seriousness and deep thought. Her concentration was evident, yet her contemplation was quiet, beautiful. Unlike any time before, she possessed a breathtaking allure. Time ticked by, the sun climbed to its zenith, then began its westward descent. The day neared its end, but the small figure at the stone table remained motionless, lost in thought, like a silent stone statue, noble and elegant. Suddenly, inspiration struck.